Chapter 1351. Seizing the opportunity while transmitting information to the mandated punishers, Alger quickly came up with a plan in his mind. He was to immediately pray to the Lord of Storms, hoping to obtain the Lord's blessings or help. Then, he would immediately rush underground and use his Beyonder powers to forcefully suppress the 3 Grade 1 sealed artifacts inside Azure Gate. During this process, if the Lord of Storms responded to his prayers, or if the abnormality regarding the seals ended in time, there was naturally no need for him to consider any other response. However, if neither of the two outcomes occurred, and he began to find it difficult to handle the situation, then he would seek Mr. Fool's help. To Alger, once he had to do so, no matter what method he used or how he concealed it, it would be difficult for him to escape the fate of being suspected. After all, it was unbelievable for a single person to suppress 3 Grade 1 sealed artifacts single-handedly. When the time came, his only option was to immediately abandon his post after the abnormality ended or the seal began working again. His departure would waste all his years of diligence and hard work, causing him to lose his post as cardinal which he had painstakingly obtained. However, compared to his own life, this was a price he was willing to pay. As for the consequences resulting in him almost not having any chance of obtaining the Book of Calamity, Alger didn't care about it at the moment. He was still a great distance from considering such problems. Of course, as a demigod of the Church of Storms and a cardinal, he believed that he was definitely under the watch of the Lord of Storms. After abandoning his job and escaping, he needed the protection of other existences to survive. Otherwise, his outcome would be unimaginable. And regarding this matter, he could only rely on Mr. Fool. Taking a deep breath, Alger quickly chanted, "The king ruling over the skies, the emperor who controls the seas, the great god of storms, I pray for your watch and pray for your blessings." After chanting, Alger reached out with his hand, bringing with him a hurricane as he flew underground. About 10 seconds later, outside the Cathedral of Waves, there was a tidal wave that surged into the air. The blue sea water poured down, enveloping the cathedral in a thick barrier. Inside the barrier, silver bolts of lightning flashed as they drilled underground. Rumble! The lightning struck down like torrential rain, illuminating all of Utopia, illuminating more than half of the Berserk Sea. At that moment, a pitch-black cathedral with many embedded skulls appeared in midair. It was situated above Zeratul, and drew all the surrounding lightning towards it, causing bolts of lightning to snake across the countless white skulls, causing the stained glass to reflect a bright light. Rumble! In the places Adam's Corpse Cathedral couldn't shelter, Zeratul's marionettes, Abomination Sua's historical projection, as well as Klein's marionettes, were instantly obliterated by the tempestuous lightning. Then, they either vanished or were reduced to tiny marks. Even Roselle Gustav's historical projection that had turned into a flux of information wasn't spared. A strong electromagnetic hurricane wreaked havoc in this city, destroying all information structures. Taking advantage of the moment the visionary was fending off the tyrant, Zeratul took a step forward and entered the void ahead. And this void was connected to another island, one he had previously set in the Berserk Sea, using his Beyonder powers of an attendant of mysteries. The distance between the two was reduced to 0. The black-robed, hooded Zeratul quickly vanished into the void illuminated by lightning. But in the next second, he didn't appear on the distant island, but above the Iris' hotel in Utopia. Just a moment ago, when Zeratul was stunned by the might of the storm, Klein, who was in Sapphira Castle, took the opportunity to use the curtain that was draped over his body and used the power of the Sapphira to forcefully graft the void in front of his target to the Iris' hotel. He had secretly changed Zeratul's key arrangement. This was the suppression effect of a king of angels against a sequence one angel of the same pathway. Rumble! The ceaseless lightning smote down, enveloping Zeratul, who had long and white whiskers on his face. Zeratul's pitch-black eyes didn't show any change in expression. His body rapidly faded and disappeared in the bolts of lightning. He had only come in the form of a historical void projection. His true body was hiding in a particular fragment in the fog of history. Sitting in the fool's chair, Klein immediately cast his gaze at the grayish-white fog below him, as well as the countless spots of light in the fog. He was temporarily unable to find Zeratul because the latter definitely used a secret fragment of history that only he or a very small number of existences knew. However, being unable to find him didn't mean that Klein could only watch and patiently wait until Zeratul reached his limits and was unable to stay in the fog of history. As the owner of Sapphira Castle and an existence with the level of a king of angels, Klein's preliminary control of the Sapphira was already enough to complete many things. In the next second, Klein opened the box and summoned the Fool card, accommodating it inside his body. In the blink of an eye, he transformed into the Fool, who wore colorful clothes and a gorgeous headdress. He exuded a deep, terrifying aura, as well as a somewhat ridiculous feeling. The entire Sapphira castle began to shake gently. Tack! The Fool Klein held the end of the Staff of the Stars in his right hand and struck the edge of the long mottled table. In the real world, grayish-white fog appeared, one that had a faintly visible ancient palace situated high above. In the ancient and majestic palace, a strange light formed from countless spherical lights quickly outlined itself, emitting an invisible and terrifying suction force. The fog of history instantly boiled as Zeratil's figure quickly appeared in a spot where Klein hadn't lit up. He was hoisted up without being able to stop it. Law of Beyonder Characteristics Convergence. With the help of Sapphira Castle, Klein projected the convergence power of Beyonder characteristics into the fog of history. At this moment, Zeratil's black-robed and hooded figure collapsed and became a pale paper figurine. His true body appeared on another island in the Berserk Sea. He quickly used the Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder powers to connect the convergence inclination effect to various paper figurines. Seizing the opportunity given to him by the paper figurines, Zeratil quickly made a wish. "I wish for my Beyonder characteristic to temporarily calm down." Just as Hebe finished speaking and pressed his palms together, Hebe had already caught sight of his fulfilled wish. This allowed him to escape the suction force from Sapphira Castle, the Fool card, and the Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder characteristic collective. At the same time, he took a step back and accurately stepped on a milky white rock. The stone had long been connected to somewhere else by him, and had been solidified in some form. As Zeratil stepped down, his figure instantly vanished. It was unknown where he had gone, but the stone seemed to experience extreme weathering as it disintegrated. The Fool Klein cast his gaze down from an infinite height and scanned his surroundings, but he couldn't find Zeratil. This meant that the other party had left his line of sight. Without any hesitation, Klein immediately placed his focus on something else. He had already made all the gems on the Staff of the Stars light up as he simulated the Marauder Pathway's ability to deceive rules. He changed the location of his body's revival to a marionette that wasn't in Utopia. Previously, a few residents of Utopia had gone to other cities for various reasons. By going there, they would further deepen their relationship with the real world. Klein had chosen a travel enthusiast. He was now in a particular mountain range. As the second half of his resurrection was carried out, Klein took out the Fool card. He summoned the 9 unique spirit world specialties he had prepared previously and placed them together with the curtain. Right on the heels of that, he used the Staff of the Stars to activate the power of Sapphira Castle and once again simulated the powers of the Marauder Pathway's ability to deceive the rules, allowing the 9 spirit world specialties and that curtain to become a part of his body. In the next second, countless fragments of light appeared around the marionette that was halfway up the mountain. And inside the marionette's body, a worm of spirit flew out. It kept fracturing and fused with the fragments of light. Soon, the fragments of light condensed into a ball of light as it solidified into Klein's figure. Just as Klein's figure finished outlining, he turned into transparent maggots that scattered in all directions, allowing the curtain and the 9 spirit world specialties to drop to the ground. Then the worms of spirit completed the reassembly process, and part of them turned into a half-top hat, a shirt, a vest, a formal suit, and trousers. Klein didn't waste any time. He immediately grabbed the curtain and the specialties of the spirit world and began to carefully concoct the potion. To him, this was the best time to advance to Attendant of Mysteries. On the one hand, the effects of the ritual had been completed with the help of the genie. This wouldn't last long, and it would gradually disappear. On the other hand, Adam, who was most likely to destroy his ritual, was being suppressed by the Lord of Storms and had no time to interfere. If he were to consume the potion and advance to Sequence 1 at any other time, Klein was really worried that visionary Adam would make use of the Sea of Collective Subconscious to inject a negative emotion into him at a critical moment. That way, losing control was inevitable. The reason why he had called Leodoro wasn't to deal with Zeratil, but to hold back the true god, Adam. During the Attendant of Mysteries ritual, there was no way to use the power of Sapphira Castle to produce a nascent form of a divine kingdom in advance, isolating Klein from the outside world. This would result in the ritual being unable to establish a connection with the corresponding region in the spirit world, resulting in failure. In less than 10 seconds, a potion that was as dark as the night sea appeared in Klein's palm. At the same time, the figure left in Sapphira Castle snapped his fingers, granting the small number of wishes accumulated in the prayer lights and the crimson stars, allowing him to digest the last bit of his miracle invoker potion. The figure inside Sapphira Castle immediately faded away, allowing Klein's body to become complete so that he could consume the potion in his best condition. As the lightning lit up the sea once again, Klein raised his right hand and brought the bottle that came from his marionette to his mouth. He gulped down the potion that was as light as air. Chapter 1352 Attendant of Mysteries. As the Attendant of Mysteries potion entered his body, Klein immediately felt a burgeoning feeling. In the blink of an eye, he lost his perception of his body and worms of spirit. He watched helplessly as they dissipated and fused into the spirit world that couldn't be described with ordinary words or common sense. It was as though he was about to disintegrate into abstract and random pieces of information. At that moment, Klein only barely maintained his consciousness and had self-awareness. Just like that, he floated in the spirit world filled with countless strange figures. After losing the ability to sense his body and beyonder characteristics, he began to experience all kinds of thoughts, information, knowledge, symbols, and labels. He completely lost himself and was teetering on the border of fusing with the spirit world. If this continued, Klein would definitely be completely lost, but at this moment, there was a connection between the spirit world and his consciousness. That place corresponded to a town. The people inside lived ordinary lives. They had their own names, their stories, and their fates. They intertwined with each other, bringing about complete information in the spirit world, which was the concept of abstractness. This town was eventually destroyed by a calamity and buried in the dust of history. Klein dispersed like a mist, almost fusing into the spirit world's body. Under the guidance of fate, he fused with the spirit world projection of the different utopian marionettes, allowing him to become corporeal again. Biome, deep underground in the Cathedral of Waves, in a room that was no longer sealed. Alger extended his hands and pressed down on the door in front of him. The surface of the door was blue in color, with numerous mysterious and odd reliefs protruding out. It was ajar, and there was no light behind the door. It was unknown which world it was connected to. The darkness seemed to have a life of its own. At this moment, a stream of water silently surged out, eroding the surrounding area. Bang! Alger's feet exerted strength, causing the ground to crack and spew out scarlet, nearly white, lava. This was a calamity he had created. His goal was to prevent the darkness from advancing. However, after the surging lava entered the darkness, it disappeared without a trace. The darkness shrank back a little and paused for a second before continuing its corrosion. Boom! Alger continuously created hurricanes, torrential rain, and lightning calamities, blocking the darkness again and again. He held the azure gate firmly with both hands, not letting it open further. If he were to only face this Grade 1 sealed artifact, Alger would have been completely fine. He would even have the capacity to attempt sealing it, but at that moment, he still had two similarly dangerous items around him. This forced him to sing loudly. He used the melody of death to influence his surroundings and disrupt the operations of the other sealed artifacts. Then, he built a wall formed from blue seawater beside him. However, the wall was slowly being dyed grayish-white, as if it had been petrified. Yet, the pandemonium didn't yield as it extended towards Alger's body. I can last for at most 30 seconds. The Lord of Storms hasn't responded the entire time. Thoughts raced through Alger's mind as he suppressed his unwillingness and reluctance. He quickly made a decision. Without any hesitation, he immediately accentuated a hexagonal crystalline snowflake on his palm. This was the mark left behind after he participated in the Tarot Club for the first time. It could substitute the reciting of an honorific name, and allow Mr. Fool to cast his gaze over Blue Mountain Island, within the primitive forest. At the door of flesh and blood, spherical lights collapsed and converged in an attempt to undergo a qualitative change. They seemed to form a body consisting of a series of doors. The body wore the blood-colored tidal wave as its robe as its body constantly warped and changed, reflecting different regions and planets. At this moment, a blinding ray of sunlight shone through the darkness. It descended from the astral world and melted everything it encountered along the way. Other than this ray of sunlight, an inscrutable darkness of the night surged over, attempting to devour Mr. Dor Bethel Abraham, who was seeking to advance to Sequence 0. The land where the altar was quaked violently, tearing open a huge hole in a bid to devour the door of flesh and blood and Bethel Abraham to fall deep into the core and face the chaos sea that contained all possible colors and possibilities. Following that, A blurry light seeped out from the void and enveloped the forest, attempting to restore the basic structure of the trees, mud, and altar. And at the only gap in the light, a pair of brass-colored eyes emerged. They stared at the door of flesh and blood and Bethel Abraham, hoping to reflect them into their eyes. Mr. Door let out a low roar, causing his blood-colored robe to flare up. The robe connected to the evil tide that surged behind the door of flesh and blood, spreading out to the crimson moonlight. The moment it touched the moonlight, the inscrutable night that could not be seen gathered on its own. It stretched out its limbs and head, turning into a shadowy female human. It possessed its own life, and its consciousness was no longer controlled by its user. Without any exception, the blinding sunlight transformed into a young man wearing fiery armor. The shaking ground grew eyes and closed its mouth. The screen that was transformed from a faint light revealed terrifying facial features. Around the brass-colored eyes, eyelashes emerged, transforming into wings. These obstructions and interferences fell into chaos, giving Mr. Door a chance for a breather. Seizing this opportunity, he entered the final step of becoming a god. At that moment, the door of flesh and blood suddenly collapsed and covered Mr. Door's body, making him seem to turn into another person. Klein's body seemed to dissociate into countless people. They had their own preferences, their personalities, their determination, and their fates. They lived in a town known as Utopia. These people quickly lived their short lifespans, waking up under the heavy storm. They came to their senses and realized what their identity was in essence. It was Zhou Ming Rue, and also Klein Moretti. They were also Sherlock Moriarty, Gehrman Sparrow, Dwayne Dantes, and Merlin Hermes. One thing could have many names, but its nature wouldn't change. The people raised their heads and looked up into infinity from the illusory city in the spirit world. They saw the illusory and thin spirit body threads, and they saw a symbol made up of the pupil-less eye and the partially contorted lines. With the symbol as the core, Klein's figure outlined itself, his eyes tightly shut. Worms of spirit, bits of Beyonder characteristics, and bits of his self-awareness flew out from the spirit world corresponding to the Utopia area and towards Klein's slightly illusory body, allowing it to slowly become corporeal. At this point, there was no clear boundary between Klein's spirit body and his physical body. They were both one and separate, and also in a rather delicate state. In other words, a spirit body could be equivalent to a body of flesh and blood. His physical body could also fuse with his spirit body. As long as Klein was willing, he could switch between two states. Of course, he could also separate his physical body from his spirit body. All of them had their individual traits, and they could be decided based on a mere thought. 2 seconds later, the reassembly process was completed. Klein, who was floating in the depths of the spirit world, opened his eyes. His pupils were dark, without any light. He had already advanced to sequence 1 and became an attendant of mysteries. Without a sound, a grayish-white fog appeared behind him. Above the fog was an ancient palace. Inside the palace stood a door that was stained bluish-black, formed from countless spherical lights. The door of light appeared rather clearly in the spirit world. It separated out a rather blurry phantom and cast it at Klein's body. As the phantom turned into a complicated symbol, it imprinted itself between Klein's brows. The entire spirit world and the real world outside began to gently shake as though they had encountered an earthquake from afar. At that moment, Klein's surroundings turned dark as illusory stars appeared one after another. They surrounded the strange door of light as though they wanted to lump together. In these illusory stars, the largest 2 overlapped and corresponded to an area in the real world. The 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th stars were located somewhere else. Through these illusory stars, Klein saw Mr. Door and Amon on a particular island. He saw Antigonus in the dilapidated palace inside the concealed world, and Zeratul who was hiding somewhere unknown. He saw Palez Zoroast in Leonard's body and dark demonic Wolf Kotar. With the help of the changes caused by further deepening his control over Sapphira Castle, Klein found the angels and kings of angels corresponding to the 3 pathways of mysteries. Of course, such a vision only lasted for a few seconds. Once Amon and Zeratul reacted and used the correct method to conceal themselves, Klein would no longer be able to lock onto their true bodies. Without any hesitation, Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. The staff of the stars that was originally placed in Sapphira Castle had appeared in his palm. He also split a portion of the worms of spirit to let them enter Sapphira Castle to prevent any abnormalities and respond to his believers. After becoming an attendant of mysteries, Klein's control over Sapphira Castle deepened, allowing him to take out items from inside at any time. In the next second, the various gems on the staff of the stars lit up as Klein's figure vanished from the spirit world. He instantly wandered to a swamp and arrived in front of Zeratul. Dressed in a hood and a black robe, the white-bearded Zeratul didn't panic. He used his Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder powers to make all kinds of connections as he extended his left hand and grabbed into the void ahead. Gradually, Alger's body turned grayish-white, almost about to petrify. Could it be that Mr. Fool doesn't favor me because of my failure to monitor Verdú? He frowned slightly, wanting to give up, but he stayed underground. At that moment, a grayish-white fog appeared in front of him. All the sealed artifacts fell silent. After Mr. Door Bethel Abraham was enveloped by the door of flesh and blood, a familiar voice echoed in his ears. You wish to bring the disaster back to the real world? Bethel Abraham's actions instantly slowed down. Give up. I have a way to deal with it. I'll let you sleep and let you get the peace you want. That familiar voice sounded again. Chapter 1353 Sacrificial Victim. Mr. Door's figure that had shrunk from the ball of light came to a halt as though he had fallen into an intense internal struggle. The layered doors in his body were just a little short of fully being reassembled. Amidst the illusory whooshing sounds, the crimson tide that barely squeezed through the gap in the door of flesh and blood became even more turbulent. The blood-colored robe landed heavily, about to envelop Bethel Abraham once again. However, as it descended, the brass-colored eyes, the young man in the fiery armor, the hazy barrier of light that accentuated terrifying facial features, the ground with opened eyes and closed mouth, and the shadowy woman vanished silently from the world. In that instant, a blazing sun appeared above the forest. Day replaced the night, causing all the shadows to rapidly disperse. This caused the blood-colored robe to rise once again, scattering even more crimson moonlight, causing all the disturbances to return to their mother's embrace. Seizing this opportunity, Mr. Door's illusory eyes closed as he lowered his head. All right. He painfully said the first word after his return to reality. His figure completely froze as he raised his right hand and pressed it to his face. The next second, Mr. Door lifted his head and wore a crystal monocle on his right eye. A beam of light erupted from the monocle, illuminating the entire world. At that moment, all the errors of the seals that had failed were fixed. Everything that seemed normal showed errors. All the clocks jumped several seconds forward. The Marauder Sequence Zero Errors ritual was to replace someone during their apotheosis ritual. And Mr. Door's return seemed to directly trigger his apotheosis ritual. The light converged immediately, and Mr. Door had turned into a mon with his pointed hat and classic black robe. The blasphemer held a simple and unadorned key that seemed to be forged from pure starlight in his hand. Above him, the blood-colored robe descended, wanting to embrace him into its arms. Behind him, the crimson tide angrily squeezed through the remnants of the door of flesh and blood in a last bid to enter the world. In that short moment, the blood-colored moon glowed even brighter, blocking the sun, night, earth, blurry light, and the strange white tower outside. Faced with the corruption from an outer deity, Amon's lips curled up slightly. He extended his right hand and took out an abnormally ancient stone slab from an unknown location. The first blasphemy slate. Then he used the stone slab formed from the Chaos Sea to block the remnant opening of the door of flesh and blood. Then he used it as a substitute to receive the falling blood-colored robe. The first blasphemy slate turned illusory, as though it was connected to an infinite sea that contained all the possible colors. The sea surged and swallowed the blood-colored robe, blocking the crimson tide from the cosmos. The already collapsed door of flesh and blood rapidly shrank before quickly disappearing. An angry and terrifying roar resounded in the air from within. In the next second, the crimson moon appeared in the sky. The color quickly faded and turned pure. On it was a huge, distorted, crimson figure. Wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, Amon adjusted the monocle on his right eye and waved his hand at the crimson figure and the bright moon that were staring at him. He then smiled and bowed slightly in all directions. In the corpse cathedral that had an erected gigantic cross where countless skulls were watching with their hollow eyes, Adam, who was dressed in a simple white robe, took a look at the ceaseless lightning outside the stained glass. He slowly got up and walked to the pool of blood that Klein had left behind. He bent down and picked up the ancient and mysterious mirror. Following that, he turned around and walked towards the second blasphemy slate. The first figure that Zeratul summoned out of the fog of history was still Roselle Gustav, who wore a dark red coat embroidered with gold thread, and had chestnut-colored curly long hair. To this attendant of mysteries, there were quite a number of angels that he got to know in his long life. There were only a few that were stronger than a Sequence 1 Knowledge Emperor. For example, the Antigonus ancestor before he became the half-fool, Angel of Fate Ouroboros, or the Red of War Brass who could indirectly obtain the strength of the Red Angel of Fate. But under such circumstances, Zeratul believed that summoning Roselle Gustav's historical void projection first was safer. Before the Antigonus family's ancestor became the half-fool, he too was a Sequence 1 attendant of mysteries. Therefore he would be suppressed by the enemy who had deeper control of Sapphira Castle and a level that surpassed most kings of angels. After all, his enemy was the closest to a true god. After Zeratul chose to cooperate with the Rose School of Thought and Adam, the success rate of summoning the Angel of Fate Ouroboros would undoubtedly drop. It wasn't suitable for him to attempt it at a critical moment. The Red of War Brass that could borrow the Red Angel's powers didn't possess the strength directly, so the actual effects produced weren't any stronger than that of Knowledge Emperor Roselle Gustav. In comparison, Zeratul would definitely choose the historical projection that he was most familiar with and the easiest to successfully summon. His plan was to seize the opportunity that Gehrman Sparrow had directly wandered here without preparing any historical void projections in advance to use Knowledge Emperor Roselle Gustav, the Red of War Army Brass, and Abomination Sua to hold him back and leave him enough time to create a miracle for himself. As soon as Roselle's figure appeared, he immediately condensed into complicated and illusory symbols in his eyes in a bid to infuse large amounts of miscellaneous and useless knowledge into his target's mind, causing his brain to explode. At the same time, Zeratul used the various connections he had set up in advance to move himself. This swamp was his home ground. As he made slippery and transparent tentacles penetrate the hooded black robe and stretch into the fog of history, he summoned the Red of War Brass. At that moment, Roselle Gustav's historical projection suddenly turned his head and used a subtle connection to look toward Zeratul's true form. Zeratul's mind was instantly filled with information and useless knowledge. His brain nearly exploded as he was unable to process his thoughts for a short period of time. He froze on the spot, his gaze not even changing. The historical projection, Knowledge Emperor Roselle Gustav, that he had summoned had betrayed him. Klein was both surprised and unsurprised by this outcome. It wasn't surprising because this was his own doing. The worms of spirit in Sapphira Castle had already grafted Roselle's present state to the concealed state that Klein had met. The surprising thing was that Adam had never reminded Zeratul to be careful of Roselle Gustav. Klein had previously sensed the coincidences in certain matters. His preparations included using the Fool Symbol's connection to Roselle Gustav's seal. Through the corresponding prayer point of light, he could throw a worm of spirit that contained certain words or intent to his fellow earthling who was in deep sleep, and awaken him. Then, using a miracle, he could temporarily suppress the corruptive powers of the Mother Goddess of Depravity. Back then, the worst-case scenario that Klein took precautions against was if something happened to him that prevented him from contacting Sapphira Castle. As such, the worms of spirit in Sapphira Castle and the worms of spirit that were scattered in different places would end up losing control and be unable to save him. Once the worm of spirit he gave Roselle mutated, Roselle would know that there was something wrong. He could then use the powers of a Black Emperor to distort order to maintain the worm of spirit's lucidity for a certain period of time. As for what plan the worm of spirit and Roselle would come up with to save himself, Klein didn't know either. This was the real reason why he could hide from Adam. With his experience in the Hall of Truth, Klein knew that he wouldn't have any secrets when facing the visionary. Any rescue plans, be it figured out from the past or on the spot, would be seen and heard clearly by Adam. At his level, the only way to avoid it was if even he himself didn't know how to save himself. Of course, visionary Adam knew without a doubt that Klein had a worm of spirit in Roselle Gustav's Black Emperor mausoleum. He knew that his backup plan definitely came from this, but he wasn't able to pry into the secrets of it because it was contaminated by the Mother Goddess of Depravity. It was a place that had been corrupted by the cosmos, and the thought of prying into Roselle Gustav was like prying into an outer deity. This was the difference in level. It was precisely because of this that Klein could calmly ask all kinds of secrets and read the second blasphemy slate. On the one hand, knowledge was indeed tempting. And on the other hand, he was stalling for time, waiting for the other side to complete the task of rescuing him. At the same time, he didn't want to occupy his mind. Otherwise, he couldn't help but think about how he could save himself. As a result, Klein began to suspect that other than the unknown reasons as to why Adam had shared so many secrets with him, was because he was also trying to lure him into thinking of the solutions he would use to save himself, so as to find clues and stop him in advance. Therefore, the question-and-answer session in the corpse cathedral was a clash of minds. Klein had to constantly control himself to prevent his thoughts from going astray. And under this premise, Adam clearly knew that there might be problems with Roselle Gustav, but he didn't remind Zeratul. Regardless of the reason, Klein had no intention of letting the opportunity slip. He immediately raised the Staff of the Stars in his hand and skillfully simulated Amon's Worm of Time's powers. Gong! An ancient mottled stone clock phantom appeared. Its face was separated into 12 different segments by grayish-white and bluish-black colors. Each segment represented a different symbol of time. Gong! One of the 3 needles in the middle of the stone clock jumped, and Zeratul's body froze on the spot. Klein immediately transformed into a maggot vortex that extended countless slippery tentacles. In the middle of the vortex was a strange door of light. The door of light didn't move as the vortex swirled around it. A terrifying suction force forcefully pulled out the Beyonder characteristics within Zeratul's body. This was the method Palez Zorost had used to deal with Amon's avatar back then. He had relied on his position to forcibly gather characteristics. Bit by bit, the Beyonder characteristics flew out at an accelerating rate. By the time Zeratul escaped his frozen state and the mental explosion, he was already unable to extricate himself. He could only watch helplessly as he was completely carried into the dark and gloomy maggot whirlpool. A few seconds later, the vortex outlined its body again, and Klein landed his feet on the ground. In the fog of history, Zeratul's figure appeared again and again, but it was impossible for him to retrieve his Beyonder characteristics. In the end, it could only fade away silently, making it difficult for him to completely revive. Klein used the ritual's remnant effects that hadn't completely dissipated and directly swallowed Zeratul's characteristic. He wanted to use this to lower the influence of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. As the corpse cathedral was still floating in the sea of lightning, Adam, who wore a simple white robe and had a faint blonde beard, suddenly appeared at the edge of the waters near the ruins of the Battle of Gods. The sea split apart, and a path appeared. It led straight to the spot which was stained with the ancient sun god's blood. It led straight to the giant king's court's projection, the forsaken land of the gods. In the depths of the forsaken land of the gods, at the top of a mountain peak, there was a huge cross erected, and there was an indistinct figure hanging upside down on it. Chapter 1354. This night late at night, the clanging sound of the door and windows opening woke Wendell up from his deep sleep. He warily rolled off the bed and surveyed his surroundings. What happened? Utopia encountered a super-heavy storm? It wasn't easy for the recently insomniac Wendell to fall asleep, but he had no choice but to get out of bed. His mind was still lethargic, and he looked rather lost. He soon realized that there was no wind blowing in from the open window, nor did the rain enter. It was like he had opened it while sleepwalking to take in fresh air. Wendell suddenly thought of the supernatural events that he had experienced and learned from the dossier. He was reminded of the fear of the unknown that once ruled his heart. He didn't know what else would happen next, nor could he guess what he would encounter. He felt a chill run down his back as he shivered again. At this moment, he heard the commotion outside the door. All sorts of voices entered his ears. There were the loud sounds of running, the sounds of judgment, the declarations of orders to be changed, and unconcealed shouts. Something is wrong with the underground seal. Be on high alert. Underground seal? What kind of item is sealed beneath the Iris's hotel? Wendell was surprised and confused. He couldn't help but walk to the door and look around. He then saw an MI9 colleague, who he barely knew, and Colonel Zyoderi Cha, who was on duty tonight. Did MI9 find Utopia because of me? They're here to handle the abnormality? Wendell instinctively frowned just as the thought flashed through his mind. He discovered that the corridor outside was completely different from the Iris's hotel. Not only were there gas lamps on both sides, but there were also classical candle stands. The floor was very bright, and the ceiling was more than 3 meters high. This isn't the Iris's hotel. Wendell suddenly turned around and sized up the room he was in. He quickly recognized that this was his sleeping quarters at MI9 headquarters. His luggage was placed quietly in a corner without any signs of movement. Wendell clearly remembered that he had headed to Utopia through the washroom in his room. He wasn't too confident in the process, so he didn't bring his luggage and only held the subpoena from Utopia's courts. Tap, tap, tap. He quickly ran to the window and looked outside. What greeted his eyes was the garden and lawn at MI9 headquarters. I am back in Backland again? Or perhaps, I didn't return to Utopia at all. I was just too tired and ended up having a dream in my sleep? Wendell dazedly walked back to his bed and sat down. After about 10 seconds, he suddenly jumped up and picked up his coat from the ground. Then, he saw the Utopian subpoena in the inner pocket of the coat when it should be inside a drawer. Wendell fell silent, as though he had become a statue. Travel columnist Monica also woke up from the banging of the doors and windows. She sat up straight, pulled the blanket up, and placed it in front of her chest. The sleepy-eyed Monica's first reaction was that a robber had barged into the hotel. She was about to scream and call for the police. But in the next 10 to 20 seconds, Monica didn't hear any footsteps entering her room. However, there were more and more people gathered along the corridor. What happened? It doesn't seem like a hurricane. Was it a prank? Damn clown, if I knew who it was, I would definitely kick his ass hard. The voices of discussion were mixed with all kinds of curses. Monica didn't think much of it when she heard it. Instead, she thought of using the crowd's discussion to consider the reason underlying the paranormal activity and write it in her traveling column. But as she listened, she gradually realized something was amiss. How could Iris's hotel have so many guests? She remembered clearly that on this floor, there were at most 5 rooms with guests. This included her room. At that moment, Monica thought of the ghost stories she had heard. She immediately felt as if there were wraiths and shadows outside. She had originally stretched her feet towards the bedside, preparing to leave the room to participate in the discussion and grasp more details for her writing material. But now, she retracted her feet and curled into a ball, trembling. A few seconds later she heard a man say, "I asked the hotel owner, and he said that he had no idea what happened. Perhaps there was a short storm just now. Return to your room and get some rest. Remember to lock the windows. Yawn. I have to get up early tomorrow to go to the Royal Museum." Royal Museum. Monica was stunned. As a travel columnist, as a traveler who had been in Utopia for a long time, she naturally knew that there was no Royal Museum. In the Lone Kingdom, a museum with such a royal name would definitely be in Backland. To take a steam locomotive from Utopia to Backland required many hours. Even if he woke up early, he wouldn't be able to arrive before the Royal Museum closed. Monica was puzzled. She slowly lifted the blanket. She heard the sound of the door and windows closing continuously. She got off the bed carefully and walked towards the door. During this process, she gradually saw the room through the moonlight. Hiss! Monica almost screamed. This wasn't the guest room she had slept in previously. Regardless of the layout or arrangement, they were completely different. The ghost stories that she had thought of earlier surged into her mind again, causing her legs to give way, and she almost couldn't support herself. Just as Monica's teeth were chattering, she saw a hotel name card on the table. It was prepared for guests. If she brought it out, she would be able to get someone to guide her back when she was lost, even if she didn't know the language. Monica subconsciously approached it and used the moonlight to identify the words on the name card. Kalpensa Hotel, Backland West Borough, 19 Morning Street. Backland West Borough. Backland. Monica's eyes widened as she felt like space and time had gone topsy-turvy. Backland. Hillston Borough. In a house with a fireplace. Furs heard the door and windows open, but she didn't immediately wake up. This was because she had fallen into a strange nightmare and couldn't break free. She dreamed that her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, had been influenced by the family's sealed artifact, dying in front of her with blood dripping. She dreamed that she had lost control and mutated, turning into a series of starlight insects that warped into the shape of doors. She couldn't help but fly towards a door of flesh and blood. She dreamed that the apocalypse had dawned, and the surging blood-colored tide had drowned the entire world, preventing Zio, Gehrman Sparrow, and company from escaping. Finally, Furs escaped the dream and sat up, panting heavily. As a demigod, one who was once an astrologer, she knew what such a dream meant. She hurriedly suppressed her emotions and looked up ahead. The glass on the oriel window in the bedroom all bore open at some point in time. Something must have happened. Furthermore, it has a certain relationship with the apocalypse, the Abraham family, and the apprentice pathway. Furs silently muttered to herself before standing up and wearing a cloak, preparing to teleport to her teacher to confirm his safety. Such a change made her feel a sense of urgency towards advancing to Sequence 3, or even Sequence 2. After learning about the apocalypse from Mr. Fool and the World Gehrman Sparrow, Furs had actually been working hard. But the secret sorcerer potion wasn't something that she could digest in a short period of time. Furthermore, without making any contributions, she couldn't bring herself to ask her teacher for the Wanderer's formula and ingredients. Of course, if she was willing, she could have obtained it from Mr. Dorr. However, how could she have been bewitched after receiving all kinds of reminders? Phasing away, Furs vanished from the room. A few seconds later, she appeared at Dorian Gray Abraham's residence and saw her teacher sitting there, pressing down on his heart as though he had been frightened. "Do you need medicine?" Furs asked carefully. She had purchased medicine from Mr. Moon to treat ailments of age. Dorian took a deep breath and shook his head. "There's no need." Furs immediately relaxed. "Teacher, I dreamed that you were affected by the negative effects of the sealed artifact. The windows and doors around me had undergone unnecessary changes, so I came over to take a look." Dorian looked up at the window open and said with a serious expression, "Your dream wasn't wrong. I nearly died just now, but at the most critical moment, the seal came into effect." Having said that, he suddenly stood up and said to Furs, "Quick, bring me somewhere else. I'm worried that something might happen to the other family members." Without any hesitation, Furs immediately grabbed her teacher's arm and asked for the exact location. Their figures rapidly faded away and disappeared. After traveling through the spirit world that was covered in gray fog for several seconds, Furs and Dorian suddenly left their present environment and landed in a place that looked like a study. There were quite a few people standing there. They were members of the Abraham family who wielded different sealed artifacts and could travel. "Velos? Why are all of you here?" Dorian blurted out. Velos and the others shook their heads at the same time, both confused and terrified. In the next second, countless dazzling stars appeared out of the void. The starlight quickly gathered together, turning into objects that fell to the ground one after another. There was a miniature door of starlight, a crystal ball formed from insects. There was a translucent, strange-looking key, a resplendent torch that burned slightly. For some reason, names after names appeared in Dorian and company's minds. Sequence 3 Wanderer Beyonder Characteristic. Sequence 4 Secret Sorcerer Beyonder Characteristic. Sequence 1 Key of Stars Beyonder Characteristic. Sequence 2 Planeswalker Beyonder Characteristic. Furthermore, there wasn't just one of each Beyonder characteristic. There were even 2 Sequence 1 Key of Stars Beyonder characteristics. In addition, there were 3 Planeswalker Beyonder characteristics, and even more of the rest. The key members of the Abraham family and Furs slowly turned agape, unable to close them for a long time. By the time all the Beyonder characteristics dropped to the ground, nothing abnormal happened again. There was silence. Chapter 1355. Wrapping up the matter. The nearly frozen silence lasted for nearly 10 seconds before the Abraham family members uniformly cast their gaze at Furs. After sensing the mixed emotions of wariness, guardedness and fear, Furs took the initiative to take a few steps to the side and warned, "Be careful of the negative effects." Even if the Beyonder characteristics hadn't fused with the surroundings and formed sealed artifacts, they contained certain negative effects. However, most of the time it would only have effects from direct contact. Of course, the Beyonder characteristics here were all high-sequence Beyonder characteristics. No one could be certain if they would actively expand their area of influence. Seeing that Furs didn't show any obvious greed, Dorian nodded and said, "When you finish digesting the secret sorcerer potion, you can consider advancing to Sequence 3 Wanderer. I'll give you the potion formula and prepare the corresponding ingredients for you. Of course, at this level, the higher the sequence, the greater the danger you face. This is an objective situation. It doesn't change because of your personal will and arrangements. When the time comes, you can decide whether you wish to advance or not." He said these words because he cared for his student, and on the other hand, he wanted to assure her that whatever the Abraham family possessed was equivalent to her possessing it. No one would treat her as an outsider and deliberately make things difficult for her on the matter of raising her sequence. This could effectively eliminate the heat brought by greed. And after obtaining so many high-sequence Beyonder characteristics, Velos and the other members of the Abraham family weren't unwilling to part with a Wanderer Beyonder characteristic. They even believed that using it to exchange for peace was absolutely worth it. After all, there was only one demigod here, Furs. Without the time to bring out their Grade 0 sealed artifacts, and because of the ineffectiveness of the seals, the Abraham family members didn't dare take out most of the Grade 1 sealed artifacts. Under such a situation, Furs had the ability to finish all of them off. Faced with her teacher's promise, Furs tersely acknowledged. Was the door to the concealed space opened? She thought that the high sequence beyonder characteristics in front of her were all from the Abraham family's treasure vault and had been thrown into the real world due to the recent abnormality. However, she did feel that there were too many of them. No. Dorian slowly shook his head, looking confused. The other Abraham family members remained silent, equally confused. No one would believe that treasure would fall from the skies unless it happened before their eyes. Should we pray to Mr. Fool? First tried giving a suggestion. Dorian, who had a vague guess, immediately looked at the other Abrahams. He saw the ones who had changed faiths to Mr. Fool nod in agreement. Those who hadn't changed faiths were clearly hesitant and eager to object. After some consideration, Dorian composed himself and said, "Gather the ones with negative area of effect traits while using the correct method. Prevent them from combining with the surroundings. I'll pray to Mr. Fool at the side." All right. The few members of the Abraham family hesitated for 2 seconds before agreeing. Following that, they seized the opportunity to identify the characteristics and attempt to gather them. After some of the members had obtained a certain amount, Dorian finally retreated to Furz's side and bowed his head to pray to Mr. Fool. Soon, a grayish-white fog and an ancient palace deep in the fog appeared in front of him. A high and solemn voice resounded in his ears. "These are the relics of Mr. Dor. Your bloodline curse has been completely removed." Relics of Mr. Dor. Relics. Dorian ruminated over the word and opened his eyes, casting his gaze at the high-sequence beyonder characteristics. He looked on silently, his vision gradually blurring. East Chester County. The Hall family manor. Alfred and the others, who had just figured out the source of the explosion and the enemy attack shout, saw the doors and windows opening at the same time as they crashed into the walls. During this process, several pieces of glass shattered. There is indeed something abnormal. Alfred raised his hand with a solemn expression. He said to his adjutant, squire, personal guards and bodyguards, "Retreat back to the main house to prevent any accidents that might happen next. At the same time, send a telegram to the Archbishop of East Chester Diocese and request for assistance." He felt that the most important thing right now was not to investigate the anomaly, but to protect his father, mother and sister. He had plenty of time to do the former after daybreak. But if anything happened to the latter, it would be impossible to make up for it. After returning to the manor's main house and arranging for strict patrols, Alfred walked into the living room and said to Earl Hall, there was indeed something abnormal, but the guard couldn't describe what he saw. He only felt extreme fear at that moment. Earl Hall nodded calmly and said, "We'll do further investigations after daybreak. Sit down and get some rest." Beside him, Audrey was holding her mother's arm as she quietly listened to her father and 2 brothers talking. Of course, this was only an image. She had been continuously releasing virtual personas in an attempt to find the reason for the sudden opening of doors and windows from the memories of eyewitnesses. After a few minutes, she ended the investigation, somewhat disappointed. For the time being, she temporarily attributed it to the influence left behind by the Mind Dragon, Airihog, and Mr. Wrath. At that moment, she realized that the golden retriever Xueqi had a strange look in her eyes. She quickly sent out a virtual persona and entered the mind island of the other party's soul to have a private conversation. "What did you discover?" Audrey asked directly. On Xueqi's mind island, a voice resounded. "I smell a thick scent of blood. At the edge of the manor. It happened sometime before the doors and windows opened." Yes, it happened about 10 seconds after the explosion. After hearing that, Audrey pursed her lips and fell silent for a few seconds. "Go take a look." Xueqi immediately stood up and tiptoed out of the living room. She left the manor's main house from a side door on the first floor. During this process, there would be people looking at her from time to time, but they didn't mind her and didn't attempt to stop her. After all, she was just a dog who had mastered psychological invisibility. After walking the path to the furthest building from the manor's main house, Xueqi twitched her nose and chose an open window before jumping in. Then, she saw a bloody corpse on the bed. Its skin had shed. And what she saw was equivalent to Audrey seeing it through the virtual persona that she planted in her mind island. In the living room inside the main house of the manor, Audrey, who was holding her mother's arm, lowered her head. Then she lifted her head, and her eyes swept slowly and deeply across her family's faces. Earl Hall, Lady Caitlin, Hibbert, and Alfred. She maintained her silence, becoming increasingly silent. "Byam. Inside the Cathedral of Waves, Alger, who was wearing a robe embroidered with the storm symbol, walked out from the underground area one step at a time. He nodded at the mandated punishers and priests who were waiting by the sides. The seals were restored to normal in time. You can return the items under your watch. Yes, Your Eminence. The mandated punishers, priests, and bishops heaved a sigh of relief as they struck their left chest with their right fists. Alger didn't say anything else as he responded with the same salute. After returning to his room, he slowly looked around. He took a deep breath and found a seat to sit down. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. Alger silently prayed to Mr. Fool, expressing his thoughts of preparing to leave the Church of Storms. The explanation that the seal was restored to normal in time could only convince relatively low-level members of the church. It was impossible to hide from any cardinal or high-ranking deacon, much less the pontiff and the Lord of Storms. And if he didn't get Mr. Fool's approval and protection, Alger didn't dare leave the Church of Storms so casually. He would definitely suffer the wrath of a god. A few seconds later, he saw the familiar boundless gray fog and heard Mr. Fool's reply. Okay. Go to the Church of the Sea God. Phew. Alger relaxed, stood up, and took off his storm robe. After changing into a linen shirt, brown jacket, and pantaloons, Alger looked at the cardinal robe on the table and fell silent for a while. Then, he reached out and folded the robe neatly. After carefully examining it for a few seconds, Alger retracted his gaze and flew out of the cathedral through the open-board window by controlling a strong wind. He first flew to the bell tower and landed on the top. He looked down at the surrounding streets and down at Byam. During this process, Alger stepped on the edge of the roof and slowly circled it. Finally, he closed his eyes. A hurricane suddenly stirred as it swept Alger towards the Church of the Sea God. In the ancient palace above the fog, Klein silently sat on the high-backed chair belonging to the fool. His figure would occasionally turn incorporeal, as though he was wearing a mysterious and classical black robe. During such instances, he wore a hood that made his face indiscernible. At other times, he would return to normal. However, he was enveloped in a faint gray fog. The frequency of this change gradually slowed down, and every time Klein transformed into the black-robed, hooded figure, slippery tentacles with strange patterns growing would extend out from under his clothes. These nearly transparent tentacles flailed about, striking everywhere as if taking the palace for itself. After a while, Klein's figure finally stabilized. Out of habit, he raised his right hand and rubbed his temples as he muttered to himself, "The awakening of the celestial worthy's will is faster and more intense than I expected. If I hadn't devoured Zeradal's Beyonder characteristic and used the remnant mental imprint to balance it and stall for time, I wouldn't have been able to adjust my state and stop him from awakening." However, this made Klein's mental state rather unstable. And he didn't lose control because his miracle invoker potion had already been completely digested, and the new attendant of mysteries Beyonder characteristic he consumed was mostly digested shortly after consumption. The identity of the world was a blessed of the owner of Sapphira Castle, making it directly equivalent to the attendant of mysteries. Therefore, Klein had already acted the role of attendant of mysteries for a very long time, and it had been quite successful. As for the second attendant of mysteries Beyonder characteristic, he still needed some time to digest it. Chapter 1356 Urgency. After stabilizing his anchors, the will of the celestial worthy, and the weak balance of his consciousness, Klein leaned back in his chair and observed the various powers brought about by the attendant of mysteries Beyonder characteristic. Among them, there were three most important ones. They were all grasped by Klein using Sapphira Castle and the Curtain ahead of time, but he just didn't know the exact names. The first was regenerate. If the materials that made up an item once had a spirit body, then the attendant of mysteries could use the powers of regenerate to summon the corresponding spirit body threads, making the item become his marionette. Then, he could establish a deep connection with the item and also naturally transform it into a marionette. To put it simply, an attendant of mysteries couldn't allow something that didn't have spirit body threads to produce spirit body threads, but he could allow some items to regenerate their spirit body threads that had long disappeared. The former represented metallic items, gold coins, gold pounds, and so on. The latter mainly consisted of beef, fish, and other food. Once humans ate food that were marionettes, they would also transform into marionettes, as though they had encountered intense corruption. The second was reassembly, which was also known as tampering. It could reassemble many physical objects or abstract concepts into something different, resulting in an unbelievable effect. It was like changing the definition, logic, orientation, or rules. The third was the realm of mysteries. This was an ability used to create an embryonic form of a divine kingdom. It could bring about a certain concealment effect. Reassembly represents the authority of change, while the realm of mysteries represents concealment. The two essential elements of the fool's symbol are in place. However, reassembly and tampering doesn't sound nice, and the meaning isn't clear enough. Grafting is still better. It's obvious at a glance. Klein mumbled inwardly before casting his gaze around. Now he had deepened his control of Sapphira Castle. He could directly borrow the powers nearing Sequence 0 of the Seer pathway. He could also use most of the Beyonder powers below Sequence 0 of the Marauder and Apprentice pathways. It was quite similar to Dark Angel Sasra from back then. Of course, Dark Angel Sasra could only use the first Blasphemy Slate to indirectly use the powers of the Chaos Sea. As for Klein, he was the owner of Sapphira Castle, one that hadn't fully gained control of the Sapphira. Therefore, his level was higher than Dark Angel Sasra's. As for strength, in theory he was stronger, but his strength was affected by too many factors. Having only become a Beyonder after a few years, Klein couldn't guarantee that he would definitely be able to defeat Heaven's Deputy and the Left Hand of God. In short, he was now considered a king of angels, and he was very close to the level of a true god. After gaining a deeper grasp of Sapphira Castle, the difference between me in here and in the outside world is almost gone. It wouldn't result in me being a king of angels outside but having the power of a true god in Sapphira Castle. The greatest advantage here is it provides me a defensive barrier that even a true god can't break. Yes, whether the outer deities can do it remains to be seen. Klein slowly exhaled as he focused his attention on the current situation. There were two things he was most worried about at present. The first was the primordial moon, which was also the mother goddess of depravity. Although she'd failed to fully descend into the real world with Mr. Door's return, a little portion of Herb's strength had invaded. Furthermore, she maintained it for a few seconds under the attacks of the 5 orthodox deities of Evernight, Steam and company. Whether this would affect the surroundings, the corresponding pathways, and exert certain effects on some matters remained to be seen. Second, Angel of Time Amon has already stolen Mr. Door's ritual and became Sequence 0 of the Marauder pathway. He would be Klein's most direct and most powerful enemy. I wonder if Amon has taken the opportunity to accommodate Mr. Door's uniqueness and sequence 1 key of stars. If he has completed this step, he will be the most powerful true god in the real world. I wonder how he compares to the Evernight goddess. No one knows how much of the death and god of combat uniquenesses the goddess has accommodated. Typically speaking, Amon shouldn't have the time to accommodate the apprentice pathway's uniqueness. Although Mr. Door's return is equivalent to the ritual itself, the most important matter at that moment was to replace Mr. Door, allowing the 3 sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics and the uniqueness of the Marauder pathway to gather together, resulting in a qualitative change. There's no time to accommodate the uniqueness of the apprentice pathway. Also, this operation has a high chance of awakening the celestial worthy. Amon wouldn't take such a risk. In other words, Amon's subsequent focus is to accommodate the uniqueness of the apprentice pathway and become a true god of 2 pathways. Otherwise, under the watch of the other true deities, it will be very difficult for him to finish off a king of angels like me. Furthermore, even if he does take the risk and succeeds, him having accommodated the apprentice pathway's uniqueness means that he has to slowly adapt and stabilize his condition, making it impossible to deal with me in a short period of time. I have to make use of the time to become the fool. Only by doing so can I use Sapphira Castle and my own level to resist Amon. I don't have much time left. Klein silently gave a self-deprecating comment. He leaned forward and gently tapped the edge of the long model table. He was analyzing the possibility of him becoming the fool in a short period of time. The digestion of the Attendant of Mysteries potion was relatively simple. By the time Klein used his anchor and consciousness to suppress the awakening of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, and not lose control or become someone else, he could use Sapphira Castle to create an avatar like Amon. Then, he could use the power of Sapphira Castle to steal the undigested Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder characteristic he got from Zeratul. At this point, Klein would immediately turn the avatar into a marionette to prevent any unexpected developments. This way, Klein would drop to the level of an Attendant of Mysteries who had fully digested the potion, and he would have an Attendant of Mysteries marionette. This was one of the main ingredients of the potion. And the Attendant of Mysteries who had digested the potion was qualified to consume the Fool's Potion and become a Sequence 0 true god. These series of operations weren't too complicated. but it was prone to mistakes. Furthermore, an ordinary dual sequence 1 King of Angels from the Seer pathway couldn't do it unless they have a sequence 2 Trojan Horse of Destiny friend of the Marauder pathway who's willing to sacrifice himself to provide help. Of course, a sequence 1 Worm of Time friend could do it. Therefore to Klein, the most troublesome thing was the other two matters. First, how to deal with the half-fool of the Antigonus family, and secondly, how to complete the ritual of fooling time, history, or fate. With my current level and strength, it isn't impossible to deal with the Antigonus family's ancestor. Of course, the prerequisite is that I should first familiarize myself with the corresponding Beyonder powers and changes in Sapphira Castle. Sigh, I don't have any idea on how to approach the fool's ritual at all. Klein raised his hand and pinched his forehead, casting his gaze at the grayish-white fog beneath Sapphira Castle. Among time, history, and fate, he was undoubtedly more familiar with history. Now, he could use Sapphira Castle to directly influence the fog of history, allowing the corresponding powers of the seer pathway to become stronger or weaker. This was the embodiment of authority. Fooling history. Fooling history. Klein tapped the edge of the long mottled table again as various thoughts flashed through his mind, but he repeatedly wrote them off. In his opinion, all the possible solutions didn't satisfy the requirements of fooling history. This was because history objectively recorded what had happened. Whatever happened was definitely reasonable. And the solutions that could satisfy the requirements, such as returning to the past, consuming the potion, and becoming the fool that came from history, wasn't able to achieve it. At the very least, Klein had never seen the ability to reverse time. As his gaze moved deep into the fog of history, Klein suddenly had a feasible idea. The present reality of history was this. The Tarot Club members believed that they were following the fool that didn't belong to this era, an awakened ancient god or an existence that surpassed an ancient god. In fact, Mr. Fool was originally just an ordinary person hanging above the gray fog. He used all sorts of resources to package himself and improve himself. Klein's thoughts were inspired by Amon. He could use Sapphira Castle to create an avatar, and let the avatar use Sapphira Castle to steal the fate, consciousness, anchors, and Zeridal sequence 1 attendant of Mystery's Beyonder characteristic. Therefore, the main body's Beyonder characteristic was formed purely from the one inside the curtain, in which the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings was slowly awakening in. This way, the understanding of the Tarot Club members was correct. Mr. Fool was a great existence that was awakening. This went against the true history, but it was a fact grounded in reality. It could fulfill the requirements of the ritual. Of course, the premise was that the act of stealing an avatar needed to happen in Sapphira Castle or other concealed areas. Otherwise, it would also be recorded in history, preventing it from achieving the effects of fooling. As for how he was to deal with the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings when he awakened, and how his avatar was to kill his true form and make him a potion, Klein was temporarily out of a solution. The result of this attempt is equivalent to suicide. Before being killed by the celestial worthy, my avatar's attendant of Mystery's Beyonder characteristic would have been digested by then. After all, I successfully revived the Lord of the Mysteries. Klein shook his head and threw the incomplete plan to the back of his mind. Under the circumstances where he couldn't think of a solution, he decided to seek advice from the existences that might know what to do. He had two targets. One was Snake of Fate Willa Septon, and the other was the Evernight Goddess. The former might have some thoughts about fooling fate, while the latter probably knew what kind of ritual the ancestor of the Antigonus family used to accommodate the fool's uniqueness. After stabilizing his mental state, Klein left Sapphira Castle and directly teleported to Backlund. Chapter 1357. Meeting deep in the forsaken land of the gods, on the peak of a mountain stood a gigantic cross that bordered the realm of reality and illusion. There was a blurry figure hanging there. Ancient wooden stakes dyed with fresh blood that didn't drip down past through his body, nailing him to the cross. At the bottom of the cross was the angel of fate Ouroboros, who was wearing a simple linen robe and had silver hair that reached his waist. He sat there cross-legged with a gentle and pious expression as he closed his eyes and prayed. Adam, whose face was half covered by a pale blonde beard, walked over and stopped in front of the huge cross. He raised his head and silently looked at the hanging figure. He held a rhodes in one hand and held the second blasphemy slate in the other. His eyes were limpid and his expression was calm. After an unknown period of time, the image of the hanged man on the huge cross suddenly faded away, connecting to the sky and to the land below with a shadow curtain. Behind the curtain, There seemed to be a pair of cold eyes watching over the world. In the next second, a rift appeared in the shadow curtain. It was dark inside, faintly reverberating with an illusory tidal wave. Adam raised his left hand and let the ancient and mysterious magic mirror emit a faint glow. In the light, a sticky but illusory black liquid surged out. A boundless sea that seemed to contain all colors appeared. It looked like it was at arm's length but couldn't affect reality. Following that, Adam placed the second blasphemy slate into the illusory scene. The illusory sea seen in the distance ebbed gently as it circled the second blasphemy slate, forming a certain connection with it. The second blasphemy slate was a manifestation of the corpse of the ancient sun god, one which was extremely close to being a great old one, and almost equivalent to the owner of the Chaos Sea. Upon seeing this scene, Adam's left hand moved slightly, allowing a rhodes to fly up and fall towards the angel of fate Ouroboros under the huge cross. The second blasphemy slate that he held underwent some subtle changes, and through the rift on the curtain, he walked inside. The shadow curtain closed and quickly faded away, leaving behind a huge empty cross. No one said a word throughout the entire process. Everything was carried out silently. Angel of Fate Ouroboros didn't even attempt to open his eyes. At the same time, Amon became a god and used the first blasphemy slate to block the tunnel that the mother goddess of depravity was trying to enter through. The Lord of Storms finally smote apart the corpse cathedral that Adam had envisioned out of nothing, and one of Adam's identities. After a while, Tail Devourer Ouroboros opened his eyes and cast his gaze at a Rhodes, which had landed on his lap. On the surface of the mirror, silver words appeared in the swirling illusory water. You should know the feeling of piously believing and following a great existence, right? Ouroboros nodded indifferently. So, can you send me back to my lord? On the surface of the mirror, silver words squirmed and formed a new sentence. Once you answer, you can ask me 2 questions. Ouroboros silently looked at the ancient mirror in silence for a long time. Finally, a Rhodes couldn't help but produce a new question. Why aren't you answering? Ouroboros looked at himself in the mirror and replied calmly. I haven't thought through it yet. 3 questions. On the surface of the magic mirror, the silver light slowly outlined 2 words. In Backlund, on a lawn that belonged to a bungalow, Willa Septon, who was already over 2 years old, was happily chasing a fat golden cat with glistening fur. Beside him was a nanny and a maid. Ever since this snake of fate was born, Aaron Sirius's career had improved by the day. Now, he owned a private hospital that provided medical services to high society. As he ran, Willa Septon stepped on a spot that was slippery. With a slip, his body involuntarily leaned back. He took a few steps back and stepped on another rock. This provided an impetus to stop Willa Septon's fall, miraculously allowing him to maintain his balance. In regards to this encounter, alarms started ringing in this chubby toddler's head. This was because with his luck, it was impossible for him to step on a spot that could make people slip. A familiar figure quickly appeared in his eyes. It was Sherlock Moriarty wearing a half-top hat and a black double-breasted coat. Willa Septon turned his head abruptly and looked at his nanny and maid. He'd discovered that they hadn't noticed the appearance of the stranger on the lawn. I have a nagging feeling you would say. Go ahead and scream. No one will hear you, the 2-year-old toddler mumbled as he turned around. Without waiting for Klein's reply, he spread his hands and said, In short, I must congratulate you on becoming a king of angels. Bullying children doesn't suit your current status. Klein let out a soft chuckle. Do you know how to fool fate? Willa Septon raised his head and looked warily at Klein. Giving me fake ice cream isn't equivalent to fooling fate. With that said, he grumbled. Why don't you squat down? At my age, it'll be bad for my next development if I have to keep raising my head like this. Klein didn't have the air of a newly advanced king of angels. He squatted down with a smile, allowing Willa Septon to look him straight in the eye. Willa Septon held his nanny's hand and said, Unless I've advanced to sequence 0 and become a wheel of fortune, fooling me in any form doesn't count as fooling fate. Klein thought and asked, You haven't found the opportunity to accommodate the die of probability? No. Willa Septon shook his head before adding, I have a premonition that it's coming soon. Klein carefully looked at the chubby 2-year-old toddler for a few seconds before suddenly smiling. If I were to give you and the die of probability to Ouroboros, would he quickly advance to sequence 0? Willa Septon glared at Klein and said, He will also need to wait for an opportunity to accommodate it. Furthermore, the opportunity to become a wheel of fortune, and the requirement to accommodate the die of probability isn't the same. As he spoke, Willow Septon curled his lips. If you wish to accommodate the fool's uniqueness, the corresponding ritual can be simplified. It won't be that difficult. In such a situation, by ingeniously using the abilities of a Trojan horse of destiny and making a sacrifice to a certain degree, there's a chance of fooling fate. However, when you attempt to advance to sequence 0, even if you accommodate the uniqueness and absorb 3 sequence 1 beyond characteristics on separate occasions, you will still have to hold a ritual, allowing the corresponding items to fuse and undergo a qualitative change. Is that so? In other words, choosing to first accommodate the uniqueness is just a trick, but in the end, I have to truly fool time, history, or fate. Klein nodded slightly and said, I roughly understand. He smiled and added, enjoy your childhood. I wonder how long it will last. With that said, Klein's figure turned transparent and vanished from the lawn. Willow Septon's other empty hand instinctively grabbed forward before retracting it weakly. He left just like that. He's so rude. He actually didn't prepare a present when he visited. The child couldn't help but mutter. Northborough in Backland. St. Samuel Cathedral. Klein, who had transformed into Dwayne Dantes, walked into the prayer hall and found a corner to sit down. He looked at the Evernight sacred emblem on the altar, lowered his head, clasped his hands, and began to pray. The Evernight goddess who stands higher than the cosmos and more eternal than eternity. You are also the mother of concealment, the empress of misfortune and horror. As he prayed, Klein's body and mind gradually settled down as though he had entered a half-awake state. After an unknown period of time, a boundless darkness appeared in front of him. Beside his feet was a clump of night vanilla and slumber flowers. This place was so quiet that even breathing seemed to disturb those in slumber around him. Before Klein could survey his surroundings, a figure suddenly descended from the depths of the darkness. There was clearly no sky or land here, but the figure seemed to come from the crimson moon or the stars in the sky. She was wearing a long layered black dress that didn't seem complicated at all. It was adorned with countless resplendent lights, as though the starry night sky had been draped upon it. Her head was indistinct and difficult to discern. He could only confirm that it was a female. Long time no see, the figure said gently before Klein spoke. Her voice was like a lullaby. Klein bowed in a gentlemanly manner and said, Is this directed at the former Lord of the Mysteries, or me who was previously hung above Sapphira Castle? Klein was very certain that this was a dream, but a dream didn't mean that it was fake. The Evernight goddess's projection said with a smile, I'm not sure where you were hanging above that door of light. After I left, I never went back again. Indeed. Klein sighed inwardly. From the details, he confirmed the origins of the Evernight goddess Ammonizes. The 3 cocoons of light that tore open were side by side. He replied simply. The Evernight goddess's projection was silently floating in the darkness, giving off a surreal feeling. Sheep said softly, the people there were all candidates meant for the Lord of the Mysteries' revival, but due to some unknown incident, he'd lost control of many things. If it wasn't for that, I would have died long ago, and lived with the identity of the Lord of the Mysteries. Then, you and Roselle wouldn't have had the chance to return to reality. This means that the death of the celestial worthy is more thorough. He can only rely on the will left inside the Beyonder characteristic and the mechanical arrangements of Sapphira Castle to revive? Klein sighed and smiled. I can already hear him whispering into my ears. Chapter 1358 Conversation. The Evernight goddess's projection calmly said, For him or them, we are unable to defeat or stop them. All we can do is resist and suppress them. Perhaps at certain times, a tiny oversight or relaxing even the slightest will turn us into him. On the path of being a Beyonder, danger is always accompanying us. No one knows when one will fall into the abyss. Klein silently added a few words for the Evernight goddess. He thought for a moment and asked, Did you cause some sort of disturbance when I was born? Seemingly fused with the surroundings, the Evernight goddess nodded slightly. I used the uniqueness in Antigonus to indirectly affect Sapphira Castle to tamper the Beyonder characteristic that accompanied your birth to the forsaken land of the gods. Indeed. Klein sighed and frowned. The uniqueness of Antigonus can indirectly influence Sapphira Castle? The Evernight goddess's projection replied gently like a lullaby. He has already lost control. This also means that his self-awareness is no longer able to suppress the Lord of the Mysteries' will in him. The 2 psyches are stitched together, revealing the most primitive, most instinctual, and also most bloody and crazy side. And the Lord of the Mysteries is the former owner of Sapphira Castle. The present Antigonus can indirectly influence Sapphira Castle by using this identity very naturally. It's no wonder the Evernight goddess has a greater understanding of the strange door of light than Emperor Roselle. On the one hand, Xueqi was born from Sapphira Castle, and on the other hand, she had imprisoned the crazy Antigonus. Klein was enlightened as he continued asking, "Why didn't you have any Beyonder characteristics accompanying you and Roselle when both of you were born? In that case, be it the Evernight goddess or Emperor Roselle, they definitely would have chosen one of the seer, apprentice, or marauder pathways." The Evernight goddess's projection said indifferently, "This is also why I said that something unknown had happened to the Lord of the Mysteries, causing many of the prior arrangements to be out of control." After 2 consecutive failures, Sapphira Castle experienced a certain change. This is also a good thing for you. As the apocalypse arrives, the remnant will of the Lord of the Mysteries has dissipated. In the end, all that's left is a mental imprint that's attempting to awaken. If you were born in the 4th epoch, you would have become him the moment you became an attendant of mysteries. This was because Klein had used the curtain left behind by the celestial worthy during his advancement. As for the Beyonder characteristics in the bodies of Antigonus and Zeratul, they had undergone generations of Beyonders and Beyonder creatures, diluting and wearing off the will. Klein had a nagging feeling that the Evernight goddess had some guesses about what had happened to the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. However, since Sheep deliberately didn't mention it, it wasn't appropriate for him to probe further. All he could do was say, "How did Antigonus manage to accommodate the fool's uniqueness?" The Evernight goddess's dream projection didn't hide anything as she replied gently. Heap sought the help of Adam and Ammon. They were supporting a Lista tutor back then. Using the abilities of the Trojan horse of destiny? Klein acutely grasped the core reason based on Will Septon's explanation and his inference. The Evernight goddess's projection that was like the starry sky of the night quietly comforted her surroundings. They'd captured a demigod from the Solomon Empire and got Adam to do a deeper-level hypnotism act and a transplant of the corresponding memory, making him believe that he was Antigonus. Then, with Ammon working with Antigonus, he stole Antigonus's identity and fate while Antigonus used the tampering authority to combine the identity and fate with the experimental subject. That demigod from the Solomon Empire began living in the state of Antigonus, and after some time, he took the initiative to accommodate the fool's uniqueness. He undoubtedly lost control. At this moment, the real Antigonus removed the tampering, allowing his identity and fate to return into Ammon's hands. Ammon ended the theft and returned them to the original owner. Klein listened attentively and added thoughtfully, "If that's the case, it's equivalent to Antigonus failing to accommodate the uniqueness and turning into a monster, and a perfectly well Antigonus with no problems at all. The 2 completely different fates existed in the real world at the same time. Therefore, fate has been fooled to a certain extent." Before he finished his sentence, Klein sensed some latent problems and hurriedly asked, "Aren't there problems with this?" "It's very risky," the Evernight goddess's dream projection calmly replied. "Fate isn't easy to bear. If one can't retrieve the fate from the target in that short period of time while he's losing control, things will undoubtedly fail. Retrieving it a second earlier will not achieve the effect of the ritual. Retrieving it a second later will lead to Antigonus shouldering the fate of losing control, and inevitably end up with the same outcome." "That's right. One has to naturally bear the burden of the troubles brought about by fate. If not for that, Ammon would have long stolen my fate and swaggered into Sapphira Castle." Klein mumbled inwardly as he began to think about how he should imitate the ritual of the Antigonus family's ancestor. It was difficult to complete a normal ritual, and with the urgency of the matter, using a simplified ritual to accommodate the fool uniqueness was the best option. "Once I become the half-fool, my control over Sapphira Castle will improve. My level and strength will at least reach the level of a true god. This way, even if I face a dual-pathway true god like Ammon, I'll be able to protect myself and wait for reinforcements even if I'm not a match for him." As Klein thought about the strength matchup and development he hoped for, he began coming up with a preliminary ritual plan. He planned on using the Evernight goddess's help to suppress the Antigonus family's ancestor and use Sapphira Castle to steal his identity, fate, and self-awareness. This way, his body would have his own consciousness, the will of the celestial worthy, Antigonus ancestor self-awareness, as well as the anchors from the New City of Silver, New Moon City, and Rorstad Archipelago. He would also become Antigonus to a certain extent and accept his fate of losing control and going mad. The reason why Antigonus went crazy was that his self-awareness could no longer suppress the awakening celestial worthy. The two psyches were stitched together. When his self-awareness reached Klein's body, he would undoubtedly repeat the same process. This was because the celestial worthy's will in Klein's body was no less than the one in his actual body. In other words, the fate of losing control and madness was unavoidable. Klein believed that there wouldn't be any additional burden when bearing it. At the same time, with him having more anchors than Antigonus, his own consciousness could remain center stage and in a harmonious state, maintaining a sliver of rationality. In such a state, he would use the identity of the Antigonus family's ancestor to accommodate the fool's uniqueness. And in the corresponding fate, this was something that he had long accommodated, so it wouldn't bring about any further repercussions. Hence, fate had been fooled. After the ritual ended, Klein would remove his theft and restore his original identity and fate, and no longer be affected by the madness, allowing him to become the half-fool. The main problem of this plan was in two places. First, it was to maintain his own state. Any slight accident could easily cause Klein to go crazy and be powerless to save himself. Second, no one knew for sure how much the celestial worthy's will in the body of the Antigonus family's ancestor would awaken or bring about unsuppressed changes. He could only rely on the Evernight goddess to balance it out. At this moment, the Evernight goddess's projection seemed to have guessed his thoughts. If you wish to steal the fate of Antigonus, it's best to let him enter a temporary state of eternal slumber. I can try to help you, but I need a medium to have the necessary confidence. This is an angel that had accommodated the fool's uniqueness. What medium? Klein asked, seemingly in thought. The Evernight goddess's projection said with a smile, the river water of the river of eternal darkness. As expected. To Klein, this answer wasn't surprising at all. It was even within his expectations. This made him feel rooted to the ground. He deliberated for a moment and said, just the river water? The Evernight goddess's projection nodded slightly and said, you won't be able to take away the entire river of eternal darkness at the moment. You'll understand once you reach the depths of Calderon City. You can ask the questions when you're back. Without waiting for Klein to answer, she added, for you, there's an unusual danger there. You better wait until your mental state is stable before you go. All right. Although Klein didn't know what he would encounter in the depths of Calderon City, he knew that he wasn't in the right state to take risks, especially when it involved a Sapphira. The Evernight goddess's projection continued, when you wake up, hold a bestowment ritual. I will give you an item that can be used to scoop up the river water of the river of eternal darkness. Klein nodded and said without a word, Adam is part of the ancient sun god, one of his identities. The Evernight goddess's projection didn't show any obvious signs of emotion. She gently said, he has already gone to the forsaken land of the gods and met the true creator. That's fast. After feeling a little surprised, Klein felt that it was only right. The reason why Adam allowed the secret to be exposed was that the secret was no longer of value. The Evernight goddess's projection continued. No matter what happens next, it will take a long period of time. You don't have to pay attention to it for now. After Klein nodded, the figure in front of him quickly turned blurry. The night vanilla and slumber flowers under his feet flew up one after another, scattering throughout the darkness. He opened his eyes and saw the dark hall and the pure light shining through the holes in the wall. The latter were like stars embedded into a velvet night sky. Chapter 1359. Early morning. Klein watched as scarlet flames suddenly appeared and engulfed him. When the sparks scattered, his figure had already vanished from St. Samuel Cathedral. In an ordinary inn's empty room, Klein walked out of the sudden rising flames and began setting up a bestowment ritual. Soon, the mysterious door formed by candlelight opened. An ancient accessory flew out from the endless darkness and landed on the altar. This accessory seemed to be made out of gold. It looked like a slender bird, surrounded by a pair of wings formed by white flames. The bronze eyes shimmered with layers of light as though there were illusory doors hidden within. Klein sincerely thanked the Evernight goddess, ended the ritual, and picked up the golden bird-shaped accessory. This seems to be the image of the legendary phoenix ancestor Greggrace. Beyond this ancient death zone pathway, she had apparently grasped partial authority of the apprentice pathway. This is a preliminary conclusion from the city ruins in the forsaken land of the gods that believed in the phoenix. It's no wonder most ancient gods find it difficult to control their emotions. They were on the edge of madness. No, they were constantly teetering between madness and rationality. Before the first blasphemy slate appeared, none of the Beyonder creatures had the concept of a sequence pathway. They only had the concept of convergence, reproduction, and blind attempts. As Klein carefully examined the golden bird-shaped accessory, he sighed inwardly. As the owner of Sapphira Castle, he could sense that there was a subtle connection between the accessory and the river of eternal darkness. So it can contain the river water of the river of eternal darkness? Yes, the river water of the river of eternal darkness is definitely not river water in the true sense of the phrase, but an abstract concept or symbol. Klein nodded in thought and threw the golden bird-shaped accessory into Sapphira Castle, sealing it in the junk pile to prevent any unnecessary accidents. On a mountain peak outside Byam City, the Red Angel evil spirit watched as the edge of the sea gradually lit up as an orange sun slowly left the horizon. At some point in time, a young man wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe appeared beside him. The man played with a crystal monocle and wore it on his right eye. It was Amon, who had become Mr. Error. Sauron Einhorn Medici turned his head and glanced at Amon. The sacrifice you provided was actually the original body. If it wasn't my true body, how could I have the time to steal the ritual and replace Bethel? Amon replied with a smile. As a qualified conspirer, you shouldn't have not thought of this. The Red Angel evil spirit scoffed. How would I know that you weren't trying to trick me? Perhaps you'd predicted my prediction? Amon smiled and didn't answer directly. Instead, Heap took out a strange crown covered in rust and blood. This is your reward. Heap threw the item to Sauron Einhorn Medici. After the Red Angel evil spirit caught the strange crown, he was somewhat surprised. Wow, you actually didn't try to go back on your word. Doing something that doesn't match your expectations is also a form of deception. Amon pinched the monocle on his right eye and said with a smile, I'm looking forward to you becoming the Red Priest and devouring that demoness. When that happens, your image will definitely be extremely interesting. As Amon said this, his smile carried an unconcealable sense of warped humor. Sauron Einhorn Medici fell silent for a moment before saying, I don't think it will be very different from how I am now. Two bloody mouths opened on both sides of his face before quickly closing. Amon adjusted the monocle on his right eye and looked to the other side of the sea. The situation in the Western continent seems interesting. With that said, the present Mr. Error, the former Angel of Time, turned into light and dissipated. The Red Angel evil spirit looked in the direction of where Amon was looking at and tossed the strange crown in his hand. On both sides of his face, the bloody mouths appeared once again as Thabe said, after absorbing this Beyonder characteristic, you'd better stay away from Bansi. If you wish to grow breasts and have your body swell up, you can continue staying there. Medici curled his lips and said, Isn't this something you both wish for? Facing the altar filled with materials and artifacts, Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. The table in front of him instantly became empty and clean. All the junk had been split up in categories and returned to their original location. This was a miracle that stemmed from one of Klein's accumulated wishes. Compared to the past miracle invokers and attendants of mysteries, the miracles I can create can be described as quite varied. It's very practical, including but not limited to building houses, interior design, garbage classification, and environment protection. Klein looked at the cleared and laughed self-deprecatingly. He then opened the door and left. He wanted to return to the real world and return to human society to strengthen his humanity and stabilize his mental state. His problem now was relatively problematic. If he directly sought Miss Justice's treatment before first suppressing the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, he would only contaminate her and allow his psychiatrist to suffer mental illnesses. Of course, if Miss Justice had reached Sequence 2, the effects wouldn't be too great. The current backland had been rebuilt, and the number of pedestrians coming and going had returned to their previous peak. Just as Klein pushed open the inn's door, he heard all sorts of voices. Wait. Fresh fish from Pritz Harbor. It has plenty of meat and little bones. It's great for frying. Special ginger beer matched with muffins and potato wedges. Hot and fresh oyster soup. The freshest vegetables. Most of the noise came from the street vendors, and some came from a small number of passengers who were chasing the public carriage or pedestrians who were knocked down by people in a rush. The early morning rush painted such a noisy, sonorous, and chaotic scene. Klein listened to these unfamiliar yet familiar shouts and silently looked at the scene in front of him. He didn't move for a few minutes. Only when a thief came close did he put his hands into the black coat's pockets and walk towards the nearest coffee shop. A cup of good coffee, a set of mutton stewed with peas, and a piece of oatmeal bread, Klein said to the affordable coffee shop's owner. A total of 11 pence, the boss said after a mental calculation. Then he added, the price of everything is rising now. Klein didn't say anything. He took out a 1 solely note from the junk pile in Sapphira Castle and handed it to the boss. He then found a seat by the window which wasn't very greasy. He took out a few pieces of tissue to line the table. Following that, Klein placed a piece of letter paper on top of it and took out a dark red fountain pen. After watching the morning scenery and pedestrians, he finally wrote, Dear Mr. Isaac, I haven't written to you for another month, because I had no choice but to sleep for some time. This isn't because I'm hurt, but because the ritual requires it. When I woke up and walked into human society again, on the streets, it suddenly reminded me of the life I had when I was in Tianjin. At that time, it was always very noisy in the morning. A large number of citizens would leave their homes, rushing to the factories or companies. The mobile peddlers gathered on the street and peddled their vegetables, food, and fruits of questionable quality. They were always cheap. I would always protect my wallet and carefully squeeze through them before heading to the station and wait for the public carriage with many people. I worked at the Blackthorn Security Company at 36 Zutland Street, and had a group of good colleagues. Dunn Smith was the captain, the supervisor there. He was an experienced, kind, and responsible beyonder. He had a mild personality and was experienced in his job. He also cared for all the members in the team, and his only flaw was his bad memory. For matters which weren't too important, he might forget about it the moment he turned around. He often said, Hold on, there's still another thing. Of course, there was a reason why. He had lost too many companions. He hoped that they would all stay in his dreams, so he often became lost as to which matter was reality and which belonged to dreams. Old Neil was my first mysticism teacher. The most useful skill he taught me was expense claims. He always designed strange ritualistic magic, hoping to obtain help from the goddess. Some of it succeeded, while others produced ridiculous accidents. Until today, I can still recall them. He was a very kind person. Even when he was seeking to fulfill his everlasting dream, he didn't wish to harm others. Leonard is a poet with his own secrets. At first, I thought he was very mysterious, and a hidden expert that needed attention to be placed on. Later, I realized that he was a crude, simple, impulsive, rebellious, aloof, and rude young man. Furthermore, he really doesn't have any literary talent, so he could only rely on memorizing things to complete the acting requirement. Yes, he barely has some merits. He's considered rather brave, and he has sharp intuition and terrifying reasoning abilities in certain matters. However, this is limited to certain matters. Fry was a cold-looking beyonder who no one dared to approach. But in fact, he has a sense of responsibility and a warm heart. He would always extend his hand when others needed help. Kenley was very short. He used to be a civilian staff member, and he then took the initiative to apply to become an official member. He was quite smart, but he would never decline a case. Every time he played cards, he would talk about his fiancée. Roseanne is the receptionist at the Blackthorn Security Company. She's lively and lazy, and she's loved by everyone. To us, she's like a younger sister. She also likes every single one of us, but she also hates all the official members because her father was once an official beyonder who later died in the course of duty. Perhaps, in her heart, official members were equivalent to people who received a notice that they were infected with a critical illness. Mrs. Oriana is an accountant, a victim of a supernatural case. She's delicate and gentle, and she pursues an exquisite life. She usually doesn't speak much, but she takes good care of everyone and doesn't make things difficult for us regarding finances. For example, she rarely rejects old Neil's expense claims, no matter how ridiculous the reason was. She would only leave it to the captain to make a decision. Mam Sikatron has rare natural white hair, and she's an unsuccessful author. She has an outstanding temperament and a quiet personality. She doesn't seem like a beyonder who fights at night. She's also very brave and very firm. Even when facing death, she doesn't flinch. Mam Royale is very similar to Fry. They don't talk much but are very concerned about their colleagues. Yes, except at the card table. Brett is the best at writing reports among the clerks. He's a romantic gentleman. Even though he's been married for 15 years, he still loves his wife very much. I think he'll live a good life because he lives by the maxim that the less he knows, the longer he'll live. Cesare Francis is our carriage driver. Despite being a civilian staff member, he often encounters dangerous situations. Therefore, the captain handed over the matters regarding the purchase of goods and applications to him. He doesn't make his presence known, and perhaps this is the key to his survival. I occasionally think about it. If it weren't for the things that happened later, I would definitely still be living in Tianjin. I would work on time every day. I'll be on duty to man the basement, and I would deal with the few cases that crop up while playing cards with my colleagues. I would occasionally accompany Melissa and Benson to watch a play or a circus show. If I can come home early one day, I'll study cooking. That's a huge hobby of mine. When the weekend comes, I might come to visit you and talk about the history of various fields. It's a pity that life is always pushing us forward and making us face changes. Chapter 1360 Choice. After Klein wrote down his impression of Tianjin, he briefly mentioned that he had completed the ritual to become a Sequence 1 attendant of mysteries, as well as resolve one of his long-time traumas, the leader of the secret order Zeratul. He didn't describe his predicament in detail, only seriously discussing the mental problems that Angel suffered. Putting away the fountain pen and folding the paper, Klein reached out to take out Azek's copper whistle from Sapphira Castle and blew at it. Inside the cheap coffee shop, white bones spewed out like fountains, forming a huge messenger. The messenger then shrank his body, becoming only the height of a normal person. At the same time, it knelt down on one knee and stretched out its palm. There's no need to be afraid of me. Upon seeing this, Klein laughed. It's not like I would do anything to you. As he spoke, he picked up the letter and placed it in the skeleton messenger's hand. The messenger nodded heavily a few times. It was unknown what it was agreeing with. Then, its body disintegrated, turning into bones that drilled into the ground. At this moment, the boss brought coffee, oatmeal bread, and mutton stewed with peas. As Klein enjoyed breakfast that wasn't too delicious but was filled with a bourgeois style, he looked out the window and enjoyed the morning scenery without any reason. He admired the pedestrians, carriages, trees, mist, food, and machinery that made up the scene. If there was no apocalypse, it's best to be a Sequence 7 Beyonder to maintain the life in Tianjin and live rather leisurely while being capable of handling most cases. When prepared, a magician, who has many tricks up his sleeve, won't appear too weak when facing Sequence 6 and Sequence 5 Beyonders. As for Faceless and Marionettist, one can easily get lost while acting. It's relatively easy to lose control when one advances, making it rather dangerous. Of course, if one has a sealed creeping hunger, it would be perfect. Klein casually thought as he recalled creeping hunger which had landed in Amon's hands. He didn't know how Amon would treat this sealed artifact, but he only felt that an item of this level was of no value to an Angel of Time. After playing for a while, he would probably throw it into a secret warehouse in the darkness. I wonder if there's a chance to retrieve it. Just as this thought flashed through Klein's mind, he suddenly felt a little guilty. This was because even if he could snatch creeping hunger back from Amon's hands, he would throw it into the junk pile, making it wait to be bestowed to the blessed or believers that needed it. This was no different from being in Amon's hands. Klein quickly diverted his attention. I lost the mirror again. Adam shouldn't be interested in a mirror at the saint level. Perhaps I can get it back. No, a road seems to have been spewed out from the Chaos Sea. In certain matters, it's possible that it can be a medium. Sigh, I only hope that Adam doesn't damage it, and that I have the time to retrieve it. After becoming an attendant of mysteries and gaining a deeper control of Sapphira Castle, Klein already possessed a certain level of authority in the concealment domain. Whenever he was thinking about important matters, there would always be a thin shadow around him that no one else could see. This was equivalent to the embryonic form of a divine kingdom, the realm of mysteries. Therefore, he dared to directly think of Adam's name. After sighing, Klein suddenly recalled something and hurriedly got the Worms of Spirit on duty in Sapphira Castle, to graft a certain area in the spirit world he fixed when he advanced over. Immediately after, he finished the leftover mutton and the last bit of oatmeal bread that he dipped into the soup. He finished the coffee beside him. After putting on his hat and standing up, Klein took a step forward and entered the spirit world that corresponded to Utopia. Then, he removed the grafting and returned to the ruins of Utopia. This was to use the abilities of grafting and his ability to freely enter the spirit world to indirectly achieve a teleportation effect. Of course, the prerequisite was that he could locate the corresponding region in the spirit world. On this point, as the owner of Sapphira Castle, Klein had a unique advantage. As for Zeratul and the other attendants of mysteries, they could only rely on their preparations. As soon as he stepped into the ruins of Utopia, Klein surveyed the area and discovered that the collapsed houses and charred corpses were shimmering with different colors. They were the Beyonder characteristics inside the monster marionettes, the wealth accumulated by Klein back in the forsaken land of the gods. This might be useless to him, but he still had many believers and blessed that would gradually increase in numbers. As a deity, he had to stock up some Beyonder characteristics in order to bestow them. Thankfully, the Lord of Storms didn't take the opportunity to sweep them away. Death. As Klein silently muttered to himself, he couldn't help but thank Leodoro. East Chester County. Inside the Hall family manor. After the sun finally rose, the suffering people returned to their rooms one after another to make up for their lack of sleep. Only Alfred, Earl Hall's personal bodyguards, the deacons, and Nighthawks sent by the Church of Evernight to investigate the reason behind the incident last night remained. As Audrey used the golden retriever, Susie, to monitor the development of the situation, she opened her bedroom door and walked in. Through the curtains and the weak sunlight in the room, a figure sat quietly on a high stool like a large doll. It was a huge, snow-white rabbit. Audrey's brows twitched as she whispered, "Mr. Wrath." This was Mr. Wrath from the psychology alchemists that had pursued the mind dragon Arihog. It was suspected to be one of Hermes's identities. As she spoke, Audrey reached out her hand and closed the door. And with this action, the back of her hand flashed with a star-like crimson tattoo. "I'm sorry. I made use of you." When the door closed, the giant white rabbit took the initiative to say, "However, I might have been used by someone else as well." Audrey thought of the opening of the doors and windows in the middle of the night and took 2 steps forward. She replied in thought, "There's no need to apologize. Just don't disturb me in the future." She was tactfully expressing that she wanted to leave the psychology alchemists, hoping that no one would come looking for her again. The huge white rabbit stared at her with its bright red eyes for a few seconds and said, "Your previous wish was to protect your parents and family, but don't you think that you've been embroiled in too much trouble? The danger that you've brought them is greater than the help you provide?" Audrey fell silent. She didn't speak for a long time. Normally speaking, a saint can indeed allow the family to gain more safety, but the premise is that they do not involve themselves in the struggle between angels or deities. Or perhaps, they are part of a powerful organization that can be relied on in the true sense of the word. Upon saying this, the huge white rabbit slowly said, "I have 2 gifts to express my apology. You can choose one." "2?" Audrey asked in a low voice. The giant white rabbit nodded, its ears constantly wiggling. "One is to truly become Miss Pride of the psychology alchemists. We can ignore all your other secrets and tacitly allow your other operations, as long as you don't reveal our matters and bring danger to the psychology alchemists. Of course, there will be a certain disadvantage. You will shoulder the burden of certain matters and might be embroiled in quite a bit of trouble. The only difference is that you will receive a lot of help and be rescued in time." What about the second one? Audrey had no intention of getting compensation from the psychology alchemists. To not have the secret organization disturb her again was the best form of apology. Furthermore, she suspected that Mr. Wrath's true intention behind his apology was just another form of exploitation. The huge white rabbit answered calmly, "I can help you divide another identity for you so that she can stay by your family and provide them with some protection and emotional comfort. As for you, you will stay away from them and live on in this world with another identity. This way, your troubles will not affect the people you want to protect. In the supernatural world, under certain circumstances, distancing yourself is the best form of love and protection." Audrey fell silent once again as her green eyes seemed like a still lake. "You don't need to answer me at once. Or you can combine the 2 methods." The giant white rabbit got off the high stool and stood up. "You know how to get into the Garden of Eden." As it spoke, its figure gradually disappeared into the sea of collective subconscious. Biome. In a room in the Church of the Sea God. The Oracle, Danitz, dressed in a gorgeous robe, sat on a chair, silently looking at Alger Wilson. The sleepiness from waking up in the middle of the night was gone from the fright. The Cardinal of the Church of Storms actually wanted to defect to the Church of the Sea God. This was a huge matter in the field of religion, in the world of mysticism and international politics. Even though he only had a rough understanding of the Church of Storms, Danitz believed that with their style in handling matters, they definitely wouldn't let this matter go. Perhaps a calamity was already on its way to the entire Rörsted archipelago to destroy it. Furthermore, a cardinal is definitely highly valued by the Lord of Storms. Alger's betrayal might attract a god's punishment at any time. The more Danitz thought about it, the more he trembled, afraid that he would be affected. This made him recall a saying from his hometown: "Don't be near people abandoned by the gods." This was because those guys might get implicated when lightning smote down. If not for the fact that Gehrman Sparrow had sent me a message in the name of being Mr. Fool's attendant to help me settle Alger Wilson in, I would have already tied up this ticking bomb and sent him back to the Church of the Lord of Storms. The more afraid Danitz was, the more he couldn't help but mutter inwardly. Of course, he was just letting his thoughts run wild. He didn't even consider their difference in strength. After a while, someone knocked on his door. Danitz jumped up and quickly walked to the door, opening a crack. "Any results?" he asked in a low voice. The intel supervisor of the Church of the Sea God said simply, "Lord Oracle, the Church of Storms has switched cardinals." "What about the original one?" Danitz pressed in surprise. "It said that he was transferred back to their headquarters." The intel supervisor recounted what he learned from some of the servants at the Cathedral of Waves. Transferred back to their headquarters. As Danitz was confused, a grayish-white fog suddenly appeared in front of him. He heard Mr. Fool's words, "From this day forth, Alger shall wear a mask and become the pontiff of the Church of the Sea God." Chapter 1361 Joint Operation Pontiff. Danitz jumped in fright, nearly unable to believe the revelation he had received. If it wasn't for the fact that this order directly came from Mr. Fool, he would have definitely cursed. Of course, if the person opposite him was Gehrman Sparrow, he would suck it up. "Lord Oracle, is there anything else?" The intel supervisor of the Church of the Sea God saw that Lord Danitz's expression was rather odd. This left him a little afraid. Danitz retracted his thoughts and forced a smile. "Pay close attention to the development at the Cathedral of Waves." "Yes, Lord Oracle." The intel supervisor heaved a sigh of relief and hurriedly bowed to bid farewell. Danitz turned his head and looked at Alger Wilson as he said with a brilliant smile, "Mr. Fool has already issued a revelation." Alger didn't hesitate. He immediately stood up and pressed his right palm against his left chest. Danitz straightened his back and solemnly said, "God said that from this day forth, Alger shall wear a mask and become the pontiff of the Church of the Sea God. Mr. Fool's will is my will." Alger couldn't hide his smile as he bowed. Half of his smile was for Danitz to see, showing his humility, while the other half was from the bottom of his heart. This was because the revelation meant two things. Mr. Fool and the Lord of Storms had reached a certain agreement. With a tacit understanding, his betrayal would no longer be pursued. Of course, he had to wear masks and use a fake name to prevent humiliation to the Church of Storms. Becoming the pontiff of the Church of the Sea God was a critical step to reaching the throne of Sea God. From Alger's point of view, this meant that he had officially become Mr. Fool's subordinate. In the future, be it the exchange for the identity of Sea God or being the leader of the Church of the Fool, there would be plenty of opportunities. As for Mr. Fool, he was a great existence that was at the same level as a true god, or even higher. How could his proxy not be an angel? After the bow, Alger waited patiently for Oracle Danitz to bring him a silver-black mask. He received the mask and wore it solemnly. While wearing a red glove, Leonard strolled along the shores of Mid-Seashire, enjoying the Rue 0026 are earned from closing a supernatural case. As for the mysterious opening of doors and windows last night, he had already received the orders from the Holy Cathedral not to pursue it through investigations or learn more about the matter. Regarding this order, Leonard couldn't do anything about it because he had long learned the general truth from old man Palaz Zoroast. Mr. Dor had returned to the real world, and Angel of Time Amon took the opportunity to steal his apotheosis ritual and advance to sequence 0 error. Almost at the same time, Mr. Fool awakened further. Through Sapphira Castle, he had briefly and weakly connected to Beyonders of the Seer, Apprentice, and Marauder pathways. As an angel of the Marauder pathway, Palaz Zoroast was undoubtedly able to sense the changes in Amon's corresponding authority and his apotheosis. He also discovered that Sapphira Castle had established a connection with him. "Old man, Amon has already advanced to sequence 0. You shouldn't be of much use to him now. Why do you still want to parasitize my body?" Leonard took in the fresh morning air as he suppressed his voice and asked with a hint of concern and confusion. In his mind, Palaz Zoroast scoffed. "Naive. Do you think that you don't need my guidance anymore after becoming a saint and having mastered a lot of mysticism knowledge? You can choose to teach me face to face, Leonard said after some deliberation. To him, having an angel parasitizing his body was both a boon and bane for him. The good thing was that even if he encountered a real mythical creature, he wouldn't be completely defenseless. As long as he softly shouted, "Old man," the problem might be resolved. In addition, history and various rare mysticism knowledge from the Fourth Epoch were also rather useful. The greatest disadvantage was that his life was in the hands of the parasite. If the other party had any evil intentions, he couldn't stop it. This question was once Leonard's greatest worry, but it wasn't too problematic now. This was because Mr. Fool's awakening was deepening, allowing him to completely suppress Palez Zoroast. Furthermore, Leonard had also become a high-ranking deacon of the Church of Evernight. He would definitely be under the watch of the Evernight goddess, and he could even be specially marked by her. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for a deity with the concealment authority to not discover Palez Zoroast. If Old Man had any nefarious thoughts, he would have been resolved long ago. What Leonard was most vexed about was that many things weren't too convenient as a result. Although he was already used to having an old man parasitizing his body, and he would even casually chat with him while on the toilet, he still preferred having that time to himself in such situations. Therefore, he felt that having Old Man leave his body, and letting him live in his house like an elder would be a better way of getting along with him. When he needed to deal with more dangerous matters, he could get Old Man to temporarily parasitize him. Upon hearing Leonard's suggestion, Palez Zoroast scoffed. "Are you still thinking about removing the parasitizing when you return home, and parasitize when out? Do you think I'm your bodyguard?" Leonard laughed dryly before saying, "If you haven't fully recovered and wish to continue parasitizing, I have no objections." Palez Zoroast fell silent for 2 seconds before his slightly aged voice resounded in Leonard's mind. Next up is actually the most dangerous period. For the position of the Lord of the Mysteries, the Fool and Amon will definitely have a battle. When the time comes, under the influence of all kinds of beyonder characteristics, angels of the same pathway might be affected. It's better to be kept under the protection of Evernight's gaze. When the Lord of the Mysteries is born, I won't even bother with you even if you were to beg me to be parasitized. Leonard was slightly taken aback as he subconsciously repeated the name. Lord of the Mysteries? This isn't something you can fully understand. Of course, with me around, there's no need to worry. Palez Zoroast sighed and said with pride. Leonard was just about to take the opportunity to ask when he suddenly saw a Red Gloves team member running over with a telegram. "Reverend, a telegram from the Holy Cathedral," the team member said respectfully. Leonard nodded slightly and received the telegram. He quickly scanned it. Head to the Southern Continent and participate in the besieging of the Rose School of Thought. Southern Continent. Rose School of Thought. Leonard narrowed down to 2 keywords. He quickly returned to the largest cathedral in the city and used large-scale ritualistic magic to establish a connection with the Holy Cathedral. In his dream, he met the Pope, Ma'am Ariana, and other high-ranking officials. After a simple exchange, Leonard roughly understood the essence of the mission. The various Orthodox churches would delegate 3 to 4 demigods to head to the Southern Continent to besiege the Rose School of Thought, which had become very active after the World War. This was a long-term mission. As the Rose School of Thought's demigods knew how to hide their tracks, they did things in a rather secretive manner. They weren't easy to locate or lock onto. It wasn't easy to deal with them either. According to what the Pope had said, it was already considered quite good to see enough results within 3 years. During this process, the Holy Cathedral would observe the situation and rotate demigods to ensure that the archbishops and high-ranking deacons were in a relatively stable mental state. After leaving the dream, Leonard looked around and suppressed his voice. "Old man, things are a little strange. Why would the various churches suddenly target the Rose School of Thought?" This wasn't an easy task. In the past few centuries, it wasn't as if the Orthodox churches hadn't made similar attempts, but they could only suppress and weaken them, without being capable of eradicating the Rose School of Thought. On the one hand, it was because there were cracks in their alliances. There was suspicion among each other and a lack of cooperation. On the other hand, due to the Rose School of Thought's demigods' indulgence, their mental states might be abnormal, but when faced with danger, they knew how to avoid, hide, and conceal. They wouldn't throw themselves into danger for no reason. In addition, with the blessings of the Chained God and the Mother Tree of Desire, it was difficult for the deities to provide precise guidance for their actions. Palez Zoroast didn't immediately answer Leonard's question. After about 10 seconds, Heap sighed and said with a slightly aged voice, "This is to eliminate potential threats, and to prepare for the apocalypse." Prepare for the apocalypse. Leonard turned to Agape and wanted to say something, but he eventually fell silent. Backlund. Harvest Church. Emlyn White had just entered the hall, but before he could head to his room and change his clothes, he saw Father Yutravsky stand up in the front pew, like a mountain rising from the ground. "Earth Mother has instructed us to head to the southern continent and bury the evildoers." The blessed spoke in a low voice. His voice reverberated in the hall, like a slow clap of thunder, causing the praying sanguine believers to open their eyes. So the dream last night was real. Emlyn was enlightened. Last night, he dreamed of the ancestor, and he dreamed that she wanted him to work with Father Yutravsky and the Rose School of Thought's temperance faction to head to the southern continent to deal with the Rose School of Thought members who believed in the primordial moon. Of course, if there was a chance, the enemies who believed in the Mother Tree of Desire would not be spared. As he often had fake revelations, Emlyn didn't take this dream to heart. He planned on changing his clothes and completing his prayers before seeking confirmation with Father Yutravsky. He tersely acknowledged before replying to Father Yutravsky in a rather composed manner. "There's no rush. I'll first contact the members of the Rose School of Thought's temperance faction." Father Yutravsky nodded nonchalantly and said, "Select some volunteer sanguine tube." In the Intis Republic, in the capital Trier, a supervisor of an intelligence agency was assigning tasks to his subordinates. Suddenly, his vision blurred as he heard a distant voice ring in his ears. "Orville. Dylan. Orville. Dylan." Chapter 1362. Witness. As a Beyonder who joined the Intis Public Security Bureau as a member of the Secret Order, it wasn't the first time that Antoine encountered something like that. In the past, whenever he advanced, he would hear Hornacis. Phlegria. Hornacis. Phlegria. He nearly lost control of himself several times. Unlike before, the content of the whispers seemed to have changed. After the ravings died down, everything in front of him returned to normal. Antoine frowned and muttered to himself, "My mental state has been very stable recently, and I haven't consumed the potion or attempted to advance. Why would I hear the whispers of a secret existence? This doesn't seem to be the same as before. What does Orville mean? I lack enough information. I can't understand it at all." Dylan, yes, the brass of the Order have mentioned that our mysterious and terrifying leader once hid an ancient castle called Dylan. Kesde, once I recall that existence, I can't help but shiver. Although he has returned to normal in the past 2 years, the terrifying legends and physical destruction that he'd left behind is enough to give people a lifetime of nightmares. Antoine calmed himself down and suppressed his puzzlement. He continued to assign missions to his subordinates. In front of a tombstone, Klein, who had just put down the white flowers, turned his head slightly, as though he was listening to something. Although he didn't hear anything, as a king of angels who wielded control over a portion of his pathway's authority, he could acutely sense that something was amiss. Some secret information was being transmitted to specific targets. "Zeratul isn't completely dead yet?" Klein retracted his gaze and muttered to himself. Back then, he had relied on his level, status, and authority to forcefully stop Zeratul's resurrection. He didn't sense anything abnormal, but after studying himself, he realized something problematic. The Beyonder characteristic he had absorbed from Zeratul was one that contained an entire set of sequence 9-to-1 Beyonder characteristics. That also meant that this only included a single miracle invoker Beyonder characteristic. And Snake of Fate Will Septon had mentioned that Zeratul and the ancestor of the Antigonus family had both taken an additional miracle invoker Beyonder characteristic in them. Therefore, the reality of the situation was that there was no doubt that there was an additional miracle invoker Beyonder characteristic on Zeratul which had vanished. As for whether there were any additional Beyonder characteristics like Scholar of Yore and Bizarro Sorcerer, Klein had no way of guessing due to his lack of understanding of Zeratul. Based on this situation, Klein had long suspected that Zeratul wasn't completely dead. Of course, if the other party wanted to revive, it wouldn't be that simple. This was because using too simple a method would result in a lack of concealment. It would definitely be discovered by the higher sequence Beyonders of the same pathway, and thus, an effective prevention method would be set up. When Zeratul was able to separate a sequence 2 Beyonder characteristic from himself, he was undoubtedly a sequence 1 attendant of mysteries. There weren't many enemies that could restrain him, ones that had to be dealt with using the most cautious of attitudes. Therefore, Klein believed that he had used the portion of the Beyonder characteristics that he had dissociated from himself to seize an opportunity. However, it wasn't to directly use it to revive. Instead, it was a way to make plenty of preparations. He needed an opportunity or some mediums to make the preparations play out. From the looks of it, he hid that portion of the Beyonder characteristic that contained the miracle invoker Beyonder characteristic in a particular manner and concealed it carefully. Otherwise, when I advanced to Attendant of Mysteries, I should have been able to use Sapphira Castle to directly see it. Yes, the next step should be to use some concealed method to guide or entice a specific target to revive him. He hasn't accommodated a uniqueness, so he can't broadcast on all channels. Besides, he has to be sure that the advanced me or Amon doesn't hear the corresponding content and spoil his plans. Therefore, the number of targets he can entice is rather limited. All members of the secret order, or a portion of the members. Klein, who was genuflecting, nodded in thought. He exhaled and grumbled without hiding anything. Why are high-sequence Beyonders of the seer pathway so difficult to kill? There were all sorts of preparations and trump cards. This made him truly understand why the goddess didn't directly kill the ancestor of the Antigonus family. For the half-fool, death might mean a new lease of life. However, an intricate and complicated setup often means that the ability to take risks is inferior. Who knows if Zeratl's resurrection plan will benefit some lucky secret order member? The possibility of this happening might even be higher than him, returning from the fog of history. Also, there's a chance of being interfered, influenced, or exploited by the outer deities. Klein sneered inwardly as he slowly stood up. He temporarily didn't have any thoughts of finding the miracle invoker Beyonder characteristic. This was because, under the immense pressure brought by Error Amon, he had no choice but to seize the opportunity to strengthen his humanity and stabilize his mental state. He had to head to Calderon City in the spirit world to retrieve the river water of the River of Eternal Darkness, so as to accommodate the fool's uniqueness. He had no time to waste on non-urgent matters. By the time he successfully advanced and restored a new balance for the situation he was in, he didn't mind heading to Intis and dealing with the members of the secret order in search of the hidden treasure vault that Zeratl had hidden. This would completely put the angel who had lived since the fourth epoch to eternal rest. He reined in his thoughts and lowered his head to look at the tombstone in front of him. Klein slowly retreated, inserted his hand into his pocket, and turned to the side to enter the spirit world. In recent times, he was like a tourist in mysticism. Occasionally, he would return to where he used to be, and occasionally, under the guidance of fate, he would casually travel around the spirit world, heading to different realities to witness different scenes. As a result, his self-awareness and self-consciousness gradually recovered and solidified. He was now able to use his anchors to suppress the awakening will of the celestial worthy to a certain extent. This made his mind a lot more stable than when he met the Evernight goddess. In the spirit world, the saturated layers that resembled an abstract oil painting, Klein wandered aimlessly as he walked a few steps in a direction that wasn't in the usual meaning of the word direction. Following the guidance of fate and spirituality, he left this place and returned to the real world. The first thing that appeared before him was a small square and a cathedral belonging to the Evernight goddess. At this moment, many people were entering the cathedral, looking delighted. "I'm back in Backlund?" Klein looked up at the sun that penetrated the thin clouds and followed the crowd to the cathedral's door. The moment he passed the entrance, his gaze suddenly froze. He saw Benson. Benson Moretti. The black-haired, brown-eyed man's face looked somewhat similar to Klein's. However, the slightly older-looking man had his hair combed neatly backward, revealing his broad forehead. He stood beside the altar, wearing a well-ironed suit, looking a little nervous. Klein stared for 2 seconds before quickly looking away. Following that, he swept his gaze across the front pew and saw Melissa in a white, conservative dress. Compared to before, the young lady's face no longer had that adolescent look on it. There was more meat to her face, making her no longer look so skinny. She kept chatting with the people around her, skillfully handling all kinds of matters and socializing. She still dresses in such an old-fashioned manner. Thankfully, she didn't wear black. The corners of Klein's lips curled up as he mumbled. He walked to a corner of the cathedral and found a seat to sit down. About 10 minutes later, Melissa finished her work and sat in her seat. The joyous music started to play as it gradually turned solemn. A lady wearing a clean white wedding gown held her father's arm in one hand and held her mother's arm with her other. She walked down the aisle towards the altar. Benson, who was standing near the altar, gulped a mouthful of saliva and couldn't help but smile. This was his wedding. Klein, who was in the corner, saw this scene and leaned back a little. He lowered his head slightly and muttered, "He smiles like a curly-haired baboon." After the bride was brought to the front of the altar by her parents, she bowed to Benson before facing the sacred emblem and the priest. Benson bowed and turned around. After the bride's parents sat down, the priest said, "Dear friends and family, we are gathered here today to witness and celebrate the union of this couple in marriage under the auspices of the benevolent goddess. Praise the Lady." All the guests present raised their right hands as long as they were believers of the Evernight goddess before drawing 4 points in a clockwise fashion, drawing out a star. This included Klein. When everyone settled down, the priest turned his head and said to the bride, "Do you, Lucy Brooke, take Benson Moretti to be your lawfully wedded husband, promising to love and cherish, through joy and sorrow, sickness and health, and whatever challenges you may face, for as long as you both shall live?" The lady named Lucy looked at the Evernight goddess's sacred emblem and nodded solemnly. "I do." Benson's smile reappeared. The priest turned to look at him and said, "Do you, Benson Moretti, take Lucy Brooke to be your lawfully wedded wife, promising to love and cherish, through joy and sorrow, sickness and health, and whatever challenges you may face, for as long as you both shall live?" Benson immediately nodded and said, "I do." Upon seeing this and hearing him, Melissa's vision turned blurry. Her heart winced along with joy. After going through all sorts of ups and downs, their family was finally welcoming a new member. Suddenly, she turned her head subconsciously to the corner and saw an empty seat. There was no one there. Melissa immediately pursed her lips and shook her head slightly. After scanning the area for several seconds, she slowly retracted her gaze and looked back at the altar. It wasn't until the priest announced that Benson and Lucy were man and wife did Melissa smile again. In the Hall family manor in Eastchester County, Klein walked out of the void. He had stabilized his mind, and could now seek treatment from his psychiatrist. At the same time, he needed to solve a problem. Chapter 1363 Treatment Plan. On the veranda covered by the autumn sun, Audrey wore a refreshing vacation straw hat and sat on a lawn chair as she leisurely flipped through a fashion magazine. There were exquisite pastries and a cup of black tea made from tea leaves from her family's manor on the round table beside her. Suddenly, she looked up to the edge of the veranda and saw Gairman Sparrow walking over in a black trench coat and silk top hat. Audrey turned her head and glanced at her maid, Annie, and realized that she, like the servants around her, ignored the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. At the same time, Audrey noticed that the surroundings seemed to darken a little. She stood up, lifting the corners of her skirt as she curtsied. During this process, she had originally planned on seriously discussing the matter between the psychology alchemists and Mr. Wrath. But on second thought, she smiled again and said in that infectious and brisk tone, "Mr. World, are you here to seek psychological counseling, or to deal with Mr. Wrath's problem?" If it was just the former, Audrey believed that the World Gairman Sparrow would let her meet him above the grey fog. That would be more convenient and faster. Therefore, this angel was definitely here under Mr. Fool's instructions to complete a mission in the real world. At the same time, she acutely sensed that Mr. World's emotions were rather mixed. He was satisfied and happy, yet depressed and sad. As Gairman Sparrow's main doctor, this situation wasn't rare. It often meant that he needed a certain degree of counseling or comfort. Both. Klein pulled a chair over and sat by the round table. "Do you want black tea or coffee?" Although Audrey hadn't taken the initiative to investigate Mr. World, she had met Dwayne Dantes many times before. They had attended meetings, banquets and dances together, and under the keen observation of a spectator, many details weren't secrets. For example, Audrey knew that when Dwayne Dantes was Gairman Sparrow, he preferred food that was sweet with a little sourness. He liked to drink coffee with sugar without milk. For black tea, he loved having lemon slices. Out of all the pastries, his first choice was the cream pastries. He loved foie gras, roasted chicken skin, and loved ribeye steaks more than beef tenderloin. His love for desi pie far exceeded bread. In addition, Audrey was undoubtedly certain that the other party was a spice enthusiast. He had high expectations of condiments, and his preferences in this aspect were inclined towards that of Desi County. Due to these details, Audrey believed that it would be very rude to not invite Mr. World to enjoy the pastries on the table. And the beverage of choice to match these snacks was undoubtedly either black tea or coffee. "Black tea," Klein answered after some thought. Miss Justice's relaxed and amiable attitude made him feel much more at ease. He felt that this state would be more beneficial for the subsequent placating. Since that was the case, it would definitely be better for him to enjoy the pastries while receiving psychological treatment. "Give me another cup of black tea and add a lemon slice," Audrey said to her maid, Annie. Annie wasn't surprised by the instructions, finding everything reasonable. She turned around and walked to the veranda's entrance, giving instructions to the servants standing there. Audrey wasn't in a rush to begin the psychological treatment process, nor did she ask Mr. World why he was in a complicated mood. She smiled as she carefully introduced the local products of the manor. She made a comparison with Dwayne Dantes' Mager Manor, and naturally informed him of the present situation regarding his butler and servants. Some stayed in the manor and continued their previous work. With Mager Manor's production, it was perfectly fine sustaining them. There was even some surplus that could be converted to funds to repair the houses and be donated to charity organizations. Audrey only sent an accountant, an assistant butler, and a staff member from the foundation to do a check on them. Some felt that, without a true employer, they couldn't play their role to their fullest potential. They felt ashamed of the salary they received and chose to resign and look for work. Some of them developed an interest in charity work and found a new calling to life and joined one of the foundations under Audrey's name. Klein listened silently, occasionally raising a question, as though he was chatting with a friend. When the tea was served, he took a sip and nodded in satisfaction. After watching him eat a piece of cream cake, Audrey's green eyes darted around as she said with a smile, "Food doesn't seem to be necessary for an angel, right?" "Yes, it's just a hobby," Klein answered simply before adding, "It can be used to maintain one's humanity." Maintain one's humanity. Audrey ruminated over the sentence. This is to resist the godhood within you? Your mental problems come under such a category? She gently guided the topic to his psychological treatment. Klein nodded slightly and said, "That's right. You should have experienced it. Every Beyonder who has obtained godhood will definitely experience it in some way. The difference is in the quantity." Audrey seriously recalled and said, "I occasionally dream of a ball of light that illuminated the entire world. Occasionally, I would hear an indescribable sound, and I would see a blurry, strange, illusory ocean that seemed to contain many conflicting thoughts. I'm certain that it was an illusion, but it was also so real. Well, I occasionally dream of a huge cross. I heard someone praying softly, but I couldn't tell the specifics no matter how I tried. The second is likely from the Sapphira, Chaos Sea, and the indirect corruption from within. The third is visionary Adam beginning to exert influence on the Beyonders of the same pathway. The first one is the primordial one awakening in the ancient sun god's body, the ancient God Almighty." Klein thought for a moment before saying in a deep voice, "The original creator created all living things and also split into various Beyonder characteristics. This is the source of being extraordinary. Therefore, every one of us has godhood in our bodies. They have the original creator's will. The more Beyonder characteristics gathered, the more he will awaken and replace us." He used the most common and most ambiguous method to explain the root of the problem in a way that wouldn't lead to corruption. This had been discussed to a certain extent at the Tarot Club, so Audrey didn't find it difficult to understand. She said thoughtfully, "That's why one needs to use one's humanity to resist godhood. At the same time, anchors are needed? Yes, the light you dream of, the indescribable sounds you hear, and the illusory ocean that you see are all a type of corruption. And the gigantic cross and prayer sounds should be a result of the influence that visionary Adam has on the Beyonders of the same pathway." Klein explained the two different situations. Audrey subconsciously sat up straight and looked around. She appeared a little afraid. "Gehrman Sparrow actually said the name of the he who must not be named." "Don't worry. He can't hear me with me by your side," Klein explained. Audrey retracted her gaze and didn't hide her surprise and astonishment. "You've already advanced to Sequence 1? Isn't that too fast?" He had only become a Sequence 2 angel slightly more than half a year ago. Klein answered frankly, "More like a king of angels." Audrey was silent for a few seconds. She pursed her lips and said with a vexed smile, "I nearly had a psychological problem just now." Klein chuckled as well. "To me, becoming a king of angels isn't necessarily a good thing. Yes, high sequence Beyonders of the spectator pathway have to pay particular attention to their mental state. To other pathways, the enhancement of godhood and the worsening corruption is rather obvious. But this isn't the case for a spectator. You have to constantly inspect and check yourself. Any tiny changes to one's personality and their understanding of things should be traced back to the source. It must be confirmed that there are no problems and that the difference can be considered a normal change. Otherwise, you'll unknowingly become another person who can coldly kill those who you originally wanted to protect. It's not easy for Beyonders of the spectator pathway to go crazy, but it's also the easiest for them to go crazy. Audrey replied in shock, I understand. She continued the topic and began asking, your mental state is unstable, and you have a psychological problem. Is it because you became a king of angels in such a short period of time that it exceeded your expectations? Yes. Klein drank a mouthful of black tea and said, the will that doesn't belong to me within me has mostly awakened. I can only barely suppress it and maintain some basic level of mental stability. As Audrey listened to Gehrman Sparrow's description, she used her Beyonder powers to observe and analyze him. After the other party finished speaking, she revealed a comforting smile and said, I roughly understand your current situation. The initial treatment plan is divided into 2 steps. I'll first enter your mind world and awaken the memories related to your humanity. Oh, it doesn't include the kind that will make you so miserable that you wish to give up. Then, when your godhood reacts, I'll use placate, hypnotism, and other Beyonder powers to reduce the corruption and the negative effects it brings, so as to help you better suppress it. Klein was silent for a moment before saying, okay. He decided to use his unique trait of maintaining lucidity in the dream and the mind world, and first gather up the memories related to the fool before, grafting them to the worms of spirit above the grey fog. At that moment, Audrey got her maid, Annie, to bring over a white silk scarf. Then, she used the thin scarf to cover her eyes and ears. Klein watched this scene in puzzlement as he waited for Miss Justice to explain. After tying the scarf, Audrey smiled and said, this is a hypnotism that allows me to seal my spirit body's perception. This way, even if I were to enter your mind world, I wouldn't be able to hear or see those awakened memories. Of course, I'll keep my spiritual intuition. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to find your island of consciousness, and I wouldn't be able to sense the changes in your godhood. I could have just hypnotized you, but you're already a king of angels. I'm worried that I'll be affected by your consciousness, so I'm using this symbolic ritual to achieve the state of being hypnotized and strengthen the effects. She calmly explained, calming Klein's mood without him realizing it. He nodded gently and said, all right, let's begin. Chapter 1364 Proactive Klein. After opening the door to the body of heart and mind, Klein carefully extracted the memories related to the fool. He gathered them together and grafted them above the grey fog. Following that, he saw the blonde-haired Audrey, who had a light white silk scarf covering her eyes, appear on the ancient stone steps. Step by step, she landed onto his mind island via the sea of collective subconscious. After some hesitation, Klein no longer allowed his consciousness to stay high in the sky. He gave up the corresponding control and allowed them to return and fuse together. If he didn't do that, he would maintain absolute rationality in the subsequent treatment, making him unable to be moved by all kinds of memories and lose the possibility of strengthening his humanity. This meant that Audrey's treatment was destined to fail right from the start. After arriving at the mind island that resembled a dream world using her spiritual intuition, Audrey stopped and spread her arms slightly. She recalled her parents' love for her, the excitement she felt when she first became a Beyonder, and the joy she felt after helping others to change her emotions and emit corresponding fluctuations. This was a method of awakening Gehrman Sparrow's memories related to his humanity. It was a Beyonder manifestation of the effects of empathy. Scenes that were worth cherishing, or those hiding deep within, flashed across Audrey's mind one after another. Beneath her feet, from the surface of the island that represented Klein's mind, firefly-like light points seeped out of the soil and floated up. Every point of light presented a different scene. A kid taking a stride forward with his short legs, receiving an ice cream. A student secretly reading novels and comics under the cover of a textbook. A teenager sitting in front of his computer and playing games with full focus. Hearing the sound of a key suddenly being inserted into a keyhole, he jumped up and performed a forced shutdown on his computer. Rushing back to his room, happy that his actions weren't discovered, he had a bounce in his step. Going to the living room, he asked his mother for pocket money, before appearing beside his father to casually ask questions about his studies. A young adult and his companions pushing a bashful friend to the corridor, right up to the person he had a crush on. Then, turning around, he laughed loudly, a young adult with some hint of adolescence to him stealing a glance downstairs, watching a figure leave, but unable to open his mouth no matter what, an employee with a slightly protruding belly waving his hand impatiently when he returned home for the holidays. After telling his parents not to serve him food or set up blind dates for him, he sees his parents' white hair and loses himself in thought when he calmed down, a scholarly-looking man and his brother and sister moving out. When they saw the dirt and dust on each other's faces, they laughed. Klein sat at the round table at the veranda, one hand holding his top hat and the other hanging in midair, as though he wanted to cover his face. 2 transparent drops of water slowly slid past the 2 sides of his nose bridge and dripped into the void. Klein closed his eyes, his expression soft and pained. In his mind island, Audrey seemed to have transformed into a whirlpool of emotions as she pulled together similar memories. After the entire island was covered in firefly-like points of light, a faint gray fog emerged. In the fog, there was a door of light that was dyed bluish-black. It was formed from illusory and brilliant spherical light. The main body of each spherical light was composed of transparent, ringed, or starlight-like worms and insects. They embraced each other and intertwined like mythical creatures. The door of light looked a little odd at first glance, but if one looked closely, they would discover that its surroundings were dark. It was as though it was wearing a hooded black robe. Thus, on a whole, it looked like an unknown mysterious person hiding under a robe. In the next second, a slippery illusory tentacle appeared under the deep black robe of the mysterious person. At that moment, although Audrey's consciousness couldn't see or hear anything, her spiritual intuition gave her a strong sense of danger. She had a feeling that a sea consisting of corruption was about to drown her. No, this isn't an illusion. She believed that if things continued to develop like this, she would get infected with a severe mental illness, or even lose control and go crazy on the spot. Audrey was just about to placate herself with all her might, weakening the corruption ahead of her when the firefly-like light dots floating above the island rapidly gathered. They illuminated the grayish-white fog, diluting the darkness around the strange door of light, making the tentacles covered in mysterious patterns shrink back. This was also the reason why Klein could receive psychological treatment only after barely suppressing the awakening celestial worthy's consciousness. This made Audrey sense the weakening of the danger, and she quickly did a psychoanalysis. Then, she immediately placated the corruption, performing a true act of hypnosis. After repeating it over and over again, Audrey took an unknown amount of time before she finally managed to obtain the initial results she expected. She then left Gehrman Sparrow's mind island and returned to her body. This treatment was very difficult, so she didn't use a virtual persona, and directly used her body of heart and mind. After sensing the end of the treatment, Klein raised his hand to wipe his face, allowing the fool's memories, grafted above the gray fog, to return to his true body. A few seconds later, Audrey removed the white silk scarf wrapped around her eyes and nose, snapping herself out of her self-hypnosis. She looked at Mr. World opposite her and muttered to herself poignantly, "Is this the mental problem brought by godhood? How terrifying." Klein nodded slightly and said, "Yes, every angel has one. The only difference is whether it's serious or very serious. Saints have it too. Even lobe and mid-sequence beyonders who aren't demigods will have it too." Audrey added with Gehrman Sparrow's former explanation. To a lobe or mid-sequence beyonder, the remnant mental imprint of the former owner of the characteristic is relatively more dangerous. Klein picked up the gold-lined cup and took a sip. This is the cruel law of the mysterious world. This is because our beyonder powers come from external objects, from the beyonder characteristics. Audrey nodded before shaking her head gently. As she contemplated, she said, "I don't think it's that pessimistic. Just like the source of every human life comes from something else. Air, bread, meat, water, etc. When we absorb them, we will also absorb their negative effects, accumulating all kinds of problems that eventually make us fall sick. However, this doesn't mean that we have to completely resist them and treat them as external objects. Once they're absorbed, there will always be some part of it that belongs to us. I didn't express it well, but I believe you should understand what I mean." Klein was taken aback for a moment before replying thoughtfully, "A beyonder's acquisition of a beyonder characteristic is like humans having food? Then one should have peace of mind and not have too many repulsive thoughts. It's about resisting it, but also working alongside it, and suppressing it, but also fusing together with it? Roughly like that." After Audrey said that, she laughed self-deprecatingly. However, this also seems to imply a negative message. Humans will eventually die, but beyonders. She didn't finish her sentence, unwilling to agitate the patient opposite her. She switched topics and said, "Pay a visit another 2 times this week. I'll be able to stabilize you under normal conditions." Yes, normal conditions. Also, you can reminisce about things when you're free, or go somewhere you yearn to go. Klein nodded and said, "What do you have in mind about Wrath's suggestion?" The smile on Audrey's face slowly disappeared as her expression gradually turned serious. Do you have any suggestions? Klein put down his teacup and calmly said, strictly speaking, the danger you bring is divided into two categories. One is when you actively or passively involve yourself in certain matters, attracting powerful enemies to your side, implicating your family, relatives, friends, and the innocent. The other is that your very existence allows some factions to target the people you value the most, doing so to threaten you. For the latter, unless you're dead, there's no way for you to ever avoid them. Of course, most of these things are a result of the former. If you give up on all your current identities in the mysticism world, and only be Mr. Fool's believer and Miss Audrey Hall from now on, no longer taking the initiative to participate in matters related to Beyonder or other matters with unpredictable elements, you can avoid most of the risks of the former and drastically reduce the latter. Under such circumstances, with the Evernight goddess favoring the Hall family, and Mr. Fool's protection provided to you is enough to deal with the rare instances of dangers, ensuring your family's safety. That's why there's no need to split off another identity. Audrey fell silent for a while. She bit her lower lip indiscernibly and asked, what if I do want to split off an identity? As long as you let that identity believe in Mr. Fool, it's not much different from what I said just now. The only difference is that, from this point forth, you'll have to stay away from your family and friends and live with another identity. Klein's voice sank slightly as he said in a serious tone, also, are you really fine with Hermes splitting off an identity for you? Audrey's emotions were disrupted by this question. Her eyes flickered as she said, however, splitting identities should be a beyonder powers of a Sequence 3 Dreamweaver. She definitely wouldn't be able to accomplish it by herself. The corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he suddenly asked, you're able to use that pride mask to enter the Garden of Eden directly? As Audrey couldn't take the initiative to mention the psychology alchemists, he very directly pointed it out. Audrey nodded gently, surprised, puzzled, and guessed something. I'm unable to pay the equivalent price, and, without waiting for her to finish, Klein said with a cold expression, on the one hand, Adam has drifted from Mr. Fool and nearly killed me. On the other hand, with the apocalypse approaching, Mr. Fool has prophesied something. When the time comes, he might fall asleep again. As his blessed, I won't be able to escape a similar fate. The payment you need to pay is that, when such an anomaly happens, perform certain dangerous things according to Mr. Fool's instructions and try hard to awaken him. Without giving Miss Justice a chance to digest this sentence, Klein extended his right hand and grabbed a few times at the void ahead of him, pulling out a grayish-white, cold persona mask. Using his status and Audrey's trust in him, he forcefully summoned the projection of the pride mask from the historical void. It's connected to my mind, so no one else can use it. Audrey subconsciously pointed out the problem when she saw this. Give me a strand of hair, Klein said calmly. Audrey didn't think too much about it. She plucked out a strand of blonde hair and handed it to Gehrman Sparrow. Klein took the strand of hair and wrapped it in the eye holes in the persona mask. Then, he held his silk hat in one hand and the grayish-white mask in the other as he slowly stood up. During this process, he mobilized Sapphira Castle and deceived the rules. Pah! Klein wore the pride mask without facing any resistance. Immediately, he saw human-clothed animals walking upright. He had entered the Garden of Eden directly. Looking at the black cathedral in the middle of the city, Klein curled his lips and took out the staff of the stars and wore the silk top hat over his head. Chapter 1365 Destruction. The moment they sensed the intrusion of a stranger, the animals wearing cloaks or exquisite long skirts stirred as they looked at Klein with a desire to attack. At that instant, Klein, who was wearing the pride mask, felt as though he was an enemy of the entire city. He wasn't unfamiliar with the situation in the Garden of Eden. He knew that the upright animals dressed as humans were in different aspects of bestial desires. They were more like conceptual and abstract entities instead of being physical. In other words, they didn't have spirit body threads, so they wouldn't suffer any physical harm. Otherwise, Klein could have hoisted these animals up, allowing them to sway with the wind. In the next second, with the bear whose suit was about to rip apart taking the lead, the animals in the Garden of Eden either bared their fangs or let out low growls as they surged towards Klein from all directions. Once bitten or hugged by them, one would be corrupted by the corresponding bestial desire. One could only rely on their willpower or the various beyonder powers of the spectator pathway to resist them. Faced with such a situation, Klein, who was wearing a half-top hat, tapped the staff of the stars. Without panicking in the slightest, he raised his left hand, spread his fingers, and suddenly closed them. The Garden of Eden, formed from Gothic-style architecture, was suddenly covered in a layer of gloom, as if a giant curtain had draped over it. Realm of the Mysteries. The embryonic form of a divine kingdom. Klein sealed off the Garden of Eden to prevent the powerhouses inside from escaping. Following that, he walked forward one step at a time, like a gentleman taking an after-meal stroll. The animals who mimicked humans by wearing human clothes rushed to his side when they naturally changed directions and embraced each other. The python with its flicking tongue devoured a canine creature filled with the desire to mate. The strange person with a colorful spider as a face bound a huge red-eyed rat up with a web. A violent werewolf bit the languid cat. The brown bear walking upright gave the fox with shiny fur a bear hug. These animals that represented bestial desire fused together as they cancelled each other out in pairs. Klein, who had grasped the authority of grafting, slowly walked through them, as though he was inspecting the concepts of humanity and bestial desires. Just like that, he walked to the 80-meter-tall cathedral and stopped. Then, he lifted his head and looked at the skulls embedded in the black pillar for 2 seconds. Klein's expression didn't change at all. He raised his left hand to press down his hat and walked up the stairs into the cathedral. He immediately saw a grand and spacious hall, with a huge cross and a grayish-white dragon statue wrapped around the cross. In front of the cross was a small long table with 5 seats on both sides of the long table. At this moment, at the end of the long table, there was a man in a black wheelchair. His face was abnormally pale, and his pale yellow eyebrows were long. His hair was neatly combed, and there were some wrinkles on his forehead. This was the leader of the psychology alchemists, Polly Durlau. At the same time, he was also the famous hermit Eric Drake, and the king of the Black Throne Barrows Hopkins. Of course, whether he was the main body or one of his various identities, no one knew. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow, who was wearing a silk top hat and a black trench coat, walk over slowly and in an extremely oppressive manner, Polly Durlau clasped the armrest of the wheelchair with both hands. When the other party entered the Garden of Eden, he didn't hesitate to leave this mind city, but he failed to do so. The eyes beneath the pride mask that seemed to move towards his forehead seemed to be mocking him. Phew! Polly Durlau quickly placated, his emotions before his eyes lit up with a pure illusory light. This light formed a pair of holy wings in front of him. Under the layers of wings, there was a pious person of light genuflecting in prayer. This was an angel. At the same time, an elder with white hair and ordinary looks appeared to the left of Polly Durlau. To his right, a priest with a pale blonde beard covering his face stood up. Ancient Angel. Hermes. Visionary Adam. Klein didn't stop walking forward as he muttered to himself, "I wish for all illusions to disappear." Just as he said that, he raised his left hand and snapped his fingers. The Angel of Light, Hermes, and Visionary Adam instantly dissipated and vanished, leaving behind a single Polly Durlau sitting in the black wheelchair. He had just used the beyonder powers of a dreamweaver to weave a few almost realistic images. Once the enemy believed that they were real, they would become real. Although the damage they caused didn't have any physical manifestations, it would make the target die for unknown reasons. Polly Durlau has made countless targets die from fright in such nightmares. Unfortunately, he had encountered Klein, a king of angels who could maintain his lucidity in dreams and also possessed true vision. He used the wish's power of a miracle invoker to easily crack the illusion. Seeing this, Polly Durlau's eyelids twitched. Without any hesitation, he pushed himself up from the black wheelchair. During this process, his body rapidly expanded as he transformed into a huge grayish-white dragon. Dragon transformation. An incomplete mythical creature form. Compared to a sequence 4 manipulator, the incomplete mythical creature form that Polly Durlau exhibited was even larger. Furthermore, there was a certain change to his head, making it closer to a lizard and not a human. It had golden vertical pupils and scales that were intertwined with mysterious patterns, making it cold and warped. As the incomplete mythical creature form appeared, all kinds of thoughts, consciousness, desires, and will swept out like a storm, attacking Klein's mind island in half illusory and half realistic ways. This was a combination of mind deprivation and mental plague, allowing every creature that was affected to experience corruption and go crazy on the spot. To an angel, such attacks were the most sinister. This was because all of them had certain problems with their mental states. They could lose control at any moment due to the tilting of the scales. Klein, who was wearing the grayish-white pride mask and half-top hat, didn't stop walking forward. He didn't attempt to avoid the plague storm at the mental level. He remained firm and stoic as he walked step by step towards Polly Durlau. In the next second, Transparent insects appeared on the back of his hand. His clothes expanded as though countless indescribable monsters were crawling underneath. Suddenly, Klein lost control and turned into a huge whirlpool formed by transparent maggots. The vortex extended out slippery tentacles with strange patterns. In the middle, there was a door of light that was dyed bluish-black. Upon seeing this scene, even in his incomplete mythical creature form, Polly Durlau found it difficult to stop his thoughts from coming to a halt as he stood rooted to the ground. The massive grayish-white dragon seemed to have become a puppet. Its head was filled with mush and its joints were all rusted. He had stared straight at a great existence that he shouldn't look at. Above the gray fog, Klein, who was sitting at the fool's seat, immediately dispersed the out-of-control historical projection. After entering the Garden of Eden and pulling out the Staff of the Stars, he had switched places with a historical void projection that the worms of spirit inside Sapphira Castle had summoned, and directly returned to his ancient palace. He clearly knew that visionary Adam had gone to the forsaken land of the gods and was attempting to fuse with the true creator, making it impossible for him to descend with his true body any time in the short foreseeable future. At most, he would send out one of his other identities, but it would be useless against a king of kings of angels. However, Klein still felt that he should be cautious, lest he fall into Adam's or Amon's trap. Following that, he summoned himself from the fog of history. He wore the pride mask and held the Staff of the Stars in his hand as he projected himself back into the cathedral of the Garden of Eden. Seeing that Polly Durlau had lost most of his rationality and was unable to control his body, Klein didn't directly control his spirit body threads to turn the mind dragon into his marionette. He maintained his pace as he slowly approached the target. In Polly Durlau's eyes, Gehrman Sparrow was like death incarnate. He approached him slowly with his own rhythm, but there was no chance of escape. At that moment, the grayish-white dragon statue on the huge cross behind him moved. Almost simultaneously, Klein raised his left hand and pulled downwards. The shadow curtain that enveloped the Garden of Eden instantly contracted, enveloping the huge cross, the grayish-white dragon statue, and Polly Durlau within. In the next second, Klein raised the curtain. The incomplete mythical creature that Polly Durlau had transformed into combined with a gigantic cross as though it was a knotted giant tree. And the grayish-white dragon statue connected the entirety of the Garden of Eden, turning the city outside the cathedral into an abnormally illusory sea that contained all colors. This wasn't the chaos sea, rather the bloating of its strength. It had been tampered by Klein and reassembled. At that moment, Gehrman Sparrow, who had been walking slowly forward, arrived beside the knotted giant tree. He raised his right hand, and under the vacant yet slightly fearful gaze of Polly Durlau, he lashed out with the Staff of the Stars. This cane that was embedded with many gems hit the target heavily, separating it into two. Between the sounds of parts falling to the ground, Polly Durlau's body that had been combined with the huge cross fell to the ground. The leader of the psychology alchemists died before he could even say his last words. While waiting for Polly Durlau's Beyonder characteristic to appear, Klein looked around and chuckled inwardly. As expected, Hermes's true goal was to use the faction backing Miss Justice to destroy the Garden of Eden and use it to escape from Adam. The mind dragon, Arihog's words made him steel his resolve. However, he should have still left a few sealed artifacts for me. There's no need to abscond with everything. Could it be that the rabbit should be wearing a greed mask instead of wrath? The psychology alchemists might appear again in the future, but the one controlling it in the shadows is no longer the Twilight Hermit Order, but Hermes himself. Chapter 1366 set up retracting his gaze. Klein cast his gaze at the Beyonder characteristic that Polly Durlau's body had produced. It was formed from thin mist, seemingly an unreal grayish-white brain from a dream. He believed that the Garden of Eden was the safest place, so he placed his true body here. All activities in the outside world are just his many different identities? Who would have known that Hermes, who was supposed to be a defensive barrier, had abandoned this place? If a real angel were guarding the Garden of Eden and had fully utilized the uniqueness of this mind city, I wouldn't be able to so easily deceive the rules and successfully infiltrate it. As Klein thought to himself, he randomly made a wish to accelerate the Beyonder characteristics formation and condensation. Pah! He snapped his fingers and fulfilled his wish. Following that, he picked up the Dreamweaver Beyonder characteristic and something that could be used as the supplementary material. He took off the pride mask on his face and left the Garden of Eden. As he left, the remaining parts of the city collapsed and merged into the boundless sea of collective subconscious. From that point onward, the legend of the Garden of Eden would emerge in many dreams, eventually drawn out by some artists, or fabricated into widespread stories. And all of the stories would come to a consensus. The Garden of Eden was eventually destroyed. Returning to the Hall family manor's veranda, Klein looked at Miss Justice, who had already composed herself, and handed over the Dream Weaver Beyonder characteristics, the corresponding ingredients, and the potion formula he had seen from the second blasphemy slate. Before Audrey could say anything, he said in a deep voice, "You can go back on your word before officially advancing." Audrey received Mr. World's gift and nodded silently, indicating that she would seriously consider it. Wearing the exquisite straw hat, she watched Gairman Sparrow turn around and walk to the edge of the veranda, disappearing step by step. After removing his traces and concealing the clues, Klein cleverly used grafting and the uniqueness of Sapphira Castle to return to Backlund, appearing in front of Judgment Zio, who was on holiday. The MI9 colonel, who was munching on an apple, immediately put down the food in her hands. As she wiped her mouth with a tissue, she stood up. What's the matter?" She cautiously didn't address him as Mr. World, nor did she call him Gairman Sparrow. Klein nodded slightly and said, "Mr. Fool got me to ask you if you wish to obtain the potion formula, Beyonder characteristic, and supplementary ingredients for Sequence 4 Imperative Mage?" Zio frowned slightly, not feeling any joy. She asked solemnly, "Then what's the price?" Klein nodded approvingly. "The apocalypse is coming. Many changes are beginning to happen, and Mr. Fool has prophesied some matters. When the time comes, it's very likely that he will enter a period of slumber again. And as his left-hand man, I'm unable to escape the same fate. The price you need to pay is that when such a situation really appears, follow the revelation left behind by Mr. Fool, doing something that might be dangerous or simple. It might be an attempt that will take a long while, or just a short moment, so as to awaken Mr. Fool." As a King of Angels seer, the owner of Sapphira Castle, Klein had long been able to make certain levels of prophecies. Recently, he had seen some blurry visions and inspiration. Therefore, without any solid plan, he consciously started putting in place various arrangements. "Right now, I'm a real charlatan." He lampooned himself in thought. Before Zio could speak, he added, "You can choose to decline. You are not the only person chosen." Zio believed that Mr. World wouldn't use sarcasm when it came to such matters. She didn't immediately answer as she seriously considered the matter. Without the pending apocalypse, she felt that she would have rejected the offer. Although a demigod was powerful and terrifying, being able to rule a battlefield and control the fates of others, and was a creature that truly possessed godhood, becoming a Sequence 4 wasn't a matter that was urgent for her. As a Sequence 5 disciplinary paladin, she was able to ensure that she completed most of the missions as a colonel of MI9, with her own capabilities. With her salary and additional income, she could maintain a very decent life for her family. Even if she were to encounter danger, she could obtain sufficient aid from the official factions. Furthermore, she could make preparations by getting Laymanos travels in advance, and ask her friend, Furs, to protect her in secret. In addition, she had investigated the cause of her father's death and fulfilled her wish to restore his honor. Therefore, no matter what, she didn't have to pay the huge price to become a Sequence 4 Beyonder. Besides, it wasn't impossible for her to get an opportunity from MI9. Of course, Zio had no idea how much longer until this would happen in the future. Be it Mr. Fool's warning, or the various prophecies I deliberately gathered using my job, it clearly or vaguely points out that the apocalypse is coming. There are only 16 years left. Zio subconsciously turned her body to look at the second floor. Under my present living conditions, Mom will definitely be able to live for another 16 years. At that time, she wouldn't be too old. Furthermore, Mr. Moon has provided all kinds of medicine to maintain her health. 16 years later, Rio will be a young man in his prime, at the peak of his career. Furs might already become a Sequence 3 Beyonder, and in order to deal with the apocalypse and seek hope, she would be busy running around, but I wouldn't be of much help. Zio slowly retracted her gaze as she fell silent. Then, she looked at the World Gairman Sparrow and nodded solemnly. "Okay. You can set up a ritual at any time and make a wish to Mr. Fool. He will fulfill your wish." Klein didn't waste any time and gave a simple explanation. His Imperative Mage Beyonder characteristic and potion formula were all obtained from the New Moon City's sacrifice. Of course, he had also bestowed his believers with a sealed artifact, General of the Pupilless Eye, in exchange. After Zio made her decision, she stopped worrying about the matter and said, Wendell apparently went to Utopia, but strangely, he returned that very night and didn't go to court to testify. That makes him puzzled and worried. Tell him that there's no need to worry about this matter anymore. All the people of Utopia were buried in a natural disaster. With that said, Klein turned and walked into the spirit world. In the outskirts of Backland East Borough, in a cemetery, Klein silently looked at the niches filled with urns of ashes and didn't look away for a long time. After a while, he slowly walked under a tree's shade. He took out the historical projection of the adventurer's harmonica and blew it. With 4 blonde red-eyed heads and dressed in a dark and complicated long dress, Rionette Tinker immediately walked out of the void. Without waiting for Miss Messenger to speak, Klein asked, The various churches are preparing to besiege the Rose School of Thought and plan on joining forces with you. Is there anything I can help you with? He had learned of the matter from Leonard and Emlyn. Rionette Tinker's 4 blonde, red-eyed heads said, There's nothing for now. Talk after locking on target. That is to say that, with the interference in divination and prophecies, and the protection from outer deities like the Mother Tree of Desire Primordial Moon, as well as kings of angels like the Chained God, the Rose School of Thought demigods aren't that easy to find. They need a certain amount of time to employ various strategies? That's right. Even a Rhodes wouldn't dare spy on them under such circumstances. Perhaps I can summon its historical void projection. Klein thought for a moment and said, If there are items directly related to them, using them as a medium I can lock onto the corresponding target. When the time came, he could use Sapphira Castle's power to penetrate the shield. All right. Rionette Tinker's 4 beautiful heads bobbed up and down at the same time. With nothing left to discuss, he planned on letting Miss Messenger return. He had originally intended to jokingly ask, Do I need to pay for the summoning this time? His spiritual perception suddenly stirred as he fell silent. A few seconds later, he took out a gold coin from Sapphira Castle. This was one of the 5 gold coins that had been tainted by Sapphira Castle's aura. The payment this time. Klein handed over the gold coin with a smile. No need, this time. After Rionette Tinker's 2 blonde red-eyed heads said that, the remaining 2 didn't say anything. She had powerful spiritual perception capabilities, and appeared as though she had sensed something. In the next second, one of the 2 blonde red-eyed heads that didn't open its mouth rose up and bit the gold coin at Klein's fingertip. All right, Klein retracted his hand and said with a smile. Then he casually asked, Is Miss Sharon and Marek still in Backland? Yes. Miss Messenger informed Klein about Herb's student's address. In a house, Marek sat at a long table and skillfully played cards with his zombies. Suddenly, Sherlock Moriarty appeared on an empty chair. He put down his hat and took the covered cards from a zombie without any hesitation. Marek looked up at him. His lips moved, but he didn't open them in the end. He let the zombie in charge of croupier duties continue to hand out the cards. Just like that, Klein joined them. He played a few rounds, winning and losing at times. In the corner, Sharon, who was wearing a black regal dress and a small and delicate bonnet, appeared at some point in time. She held her face with one hand and quietly watched the game. After playing for about 2 hours, Klein stood up and formally bowed to Miss Sharon and Marek. Then he chuckled, put on his hat, walked towards the door and disappeared. Deep in the spirit world, Klein, who had finished a course of 3 treatments, appeared outside Calderon City. Chapter 1367 Distributary. As he didn't know what state Amon was in right now, Klein didn't dare delay. After his mental problems were resolved, he immediately came to Calderon City and prepared to obtain the river water of the River of Eternal Darkness. And because it involved a Sapphira, he could only vaguely see some visions when using divination or making a prophecy. He couldn't accurately make a judgment. After surveying the area, Klein raised his hand to summon the historical void projection from a few minutes ago, allowing his true body to return to Sapphira Castle. His consciousness then shifted to the projection, making it corporeal. Following that, Klein grabbed at the void again and pulled out the Staff of the Stars' historical projection. To be honest, after being able to use most of the Beyonder powers below Sequence 0 of the Apprentice pathway through Sapphira Castle, Klein no longer needed a Grade 0 sealed artifact like the Staff of the Stars. He could basically replicate whatever mystical effects it had without the negative effects. However, he always felt that an angel still had to possess a close combat weapon because it was possible to fall into a region that nullified Beyonder powers at some point in time. In the mysterious world, this was definitely something that could happen. Be it the law restrictions from the arbiter pathway, or the beyonder effects of a particular outer deity, it was possible to achieve similar effects. Under such circumstances, if he picked up a hard staff that came with passive effects and directly smashed it in the enemy's head, it would prove to be rather effective. As a king of angels of the seer pathway, making preparations in all aspects was an instinct. After weighing the staff of the stars and pressing down on his top hat, Klein took out the golden bird-shaped accessory from Sapphira Castle and placed it in his left breast pocket. Then he took a step and entered Calderon City, the divine kingdom of ancient death, Phoenix ancestor Gregrace. The first thing that entered his vision was a huge bottomless pit. All sorts of strange buildings circled the deep pit and extended downwards in circles, forming a grand city that was beyond the understanding of ordinary people. Some of the buildings were standalone houses that stood atop pale white stone pillars, while others were huge rectangular coffins. There were no windows, and the doors were on the roofs. Some of them were just tombs with gravestones at the entrance, while others were constructed from all kinds of bones, making them seem rather messy. The closer to the bottom of the pit, the more intact the buildings were. The closer they got to the top, the more they collapsed, filled with the decay and ruin of time. With just a glance, Klein made a faint grayish-white fog appear around him. He directly used Sapphira Castle's status to resist the laws of Calderon City, which turned all living beings into the dead. To him, becoming a dead person wasn't a negative effect, but he didn't like that cold and indifferent feeling. The grayish-white tide that rose previously has receded. Klein, who was wearing a top hat and trench coat while carrying the staff, nodded in thought. With one step, he stepped deep into Calderon City, which could be seen with the naked eye. This time, he used the Marauder Pathway's Beyonder powers to steal the distance of his perception so as to avoid being entangled with the various dangerous monsters that were active in this mysterious city. This wasn't something he was afraid of. The ones who should be afraid were the monsters. If it wasn't for the fact that he didn't wish to waste time, he wouldn't have minded taking the opportunity to gather a batch of marionettes to make up for the losses caused by the destruction of Utopia. Apart from this reason, Klein was still cautious about something else. Calderon City was a city of the dead. It was very likely that in the deepest depths of the city flowed the river of eternal darkness. And in essence, marionettes were already dead, so once they approached anywhere close to the bottom, there was a possibility of a mutation. Venturing deeper one step at a time, Klein realized that he had thought too much. None of the monsters hidden in this strange city dared to appear. The aura of Sapphira Castle allowed their instinctual desire to live to overcome their inclinations of madness and their habits of hunting. The deeper he went, the quieter his surroundings became. The strange buildings remained intact, but they seemed to be dead for years. Even their auras were cold, gloomy, and decadent. It's the same as looking at a black and white film. If I didn't hear my breathing and heartbeat, I would have suspected that I was deaf. Klein coughed lightly and used his grumbling to resist the silence of death. His intuition told him that once he got used to this environment, his body and mind would become still and silent. Then, he would truly die in the full meaning of the word. The closer he got to the ground, the stronger this feeling became. As he kept stealing the distance, Klein proceeded forward for a long time before finally seeing the bottom of the pit. No, this wasn't the true base of the pit. It was just a huge black palace that stood in the way. The palace was propped up by columns. There were all kinds of bones and different corpse pieces embedded in them. Some parts of the palace were even covered in blood. They belonged to different races. Klein stared at it for a few seconds. Without any hesitation, he carried the staff of the stars and entered the palace through the open door. On both sides of the hall were different types of coffins in different colors. They sat there silently, as if they had already been weathered by death. As Klein entered, there was a sudden noise coming from inside the coffins. It sounded like a rusted joint opening. The grayish-white fog around Klein thickened again as all the coffins suddenly quietened down. Ignoring them, Klein walked to the depths of the hall. There was a grayish-white stone staircase descending with a huge stone monument erected at the entrance. At the top of the stone monument stood a long and slender statue that resembled a giant bird made of bronze. Its wings had all kinds of pale white symbols. Under the bronze bird-shaped statue, the surface of the stone monument was written in text that originated from the language of the dead. Their shapes were all different, looking like simplified birds or coiled snakes that looked different. They formed a few indistinct words. Even deities cannot escape. Imprisonment even in death. Is this a warning to all living beings who come to Calderon City to not go down the stairs? It directly leads to the river of eternal darkness? Klein's thoughts raced as he carefully read the words on the stone monument. From his point of view, this meant that, even if a sequence 0 true deity were to approach the river of eternal darkness, they would be trapped there and unable to escape. And even if they were to die, they would still be imprisoned by this abstract river, this Sapphira. Although they wouldn't dissipate, they wouldn't be able to escape. From the looks of it, it's just like the Chaos Sea. Without any spheroid protection, merely approaching the river of eternal darkness will result in a terrifying mutation. Klein retracted his gaze and tidied up the golden bird-shaped accessory attached to his breast pocket. He walked past the bronze statue's stone monument and walked down the grayish-white staircase. He didn't steal the distance again, to prevent himself from slamming headfirst into danger. In the dark, silent, and cold environment, the golden bird-shaped accessory in front of Klein's chest released a pale white glow, illuminating a small area. It was like a tiny lifeboat struggling in the waves of death. After descending for an unknown period of time, the aura of Sapphira Castle around him expanded out of reflex and became extremely thick, like a grayish-white cocoon. At the same time, Klein turned his head slightly and heard a faint, illusory whooshing sound. This seemed to indicate that a dark river was slowly flowing deep underground not far from him. In the next second, Klein looked down at his feet. At some point in time, there was a dark stream of incorporeal water surging out from somewhere. Even light couldn't exist on its surface. This is different from what I saw last time. Klein frowned slightly. Back when he came to Calderon City to hunt the spirit world plunderer, he had caused a certain change, causing large amounts of grayish-white illusory tidal water to surge up the bottom of the pit. The colors that he saw the two times were completely different. Just as Klein's thoughts raced, at the bottom of the stone staircase, where the dark tide surged over, a thin grayish-white fog spread up. Together with the illusory liquid, it expanded into a grayish-white liquid that was more mist-like. When the water reached Klein's feet, it silently shrank back as though it was constantly ebbing up and down at a particular frequency. This faint gray fog is a little familiar. Klein's expression turned solemn. After pausing for a few seconds, he continued down. This time, the rising illusory tide drowned him, causing his body to turn light, causing his emotions to quickly turn cold and his thoughts to gradually weaken. If not for the protection of Sapphira Castle's aura around him, Klein suspected that he would passively fuse with the tide without being able to resist. Following that, the grayish-white cocoon rose and bobbed up and down in the water before slowly reaching the end of the staircase. At the end was a void. Amidst the emptiness flowed a straight, wide, illusory, colorless, dark river. This river was so blurry that it was difficult to see it clearly. This was because its surroundings were covered with a swath of grayish-white like a thin layer of fog. Indeed, Klein couldn't help but mutter when he saw this. He was no stranger to this kind of fog. He had seen it behind the door in Bansi's ruins before. He had seen it at the easternmost end of the forsaken land of the gods before, as well as beneath Sapphira Castle. And unlike other places, there was a portion of the water from the river of eternal darkness that penetrated the grayish-white fog and fused to some extent with the latter, changing colors between dark black and pale white. The river water here kept swirling up before falling down, like a stream that was running through the illusory darkness. On both sides of the distributary stood huge and pale white stone pillars. They seemed to be supporting something, preventing whatever it was from collapsing. At this moment, between the stone pillars, and on the banks of the distributary, countless blurry, translucent figures were pacing back and forth, slowly but unceasingly. Among them, the most eye-catching one was a seemingly lost figure that would occasionally enter into the depths of the distributary before turning around. Yet, it didn't seem like it could leave the river. It was huge, similar to the stone pillars around it. It had a heavy black robe draped over it, and from its side profile, it looked very old. Suddenly, it turned its head and looked at Klein. Its face had obvious southern continent characteristics, but it had already rotted while white feathers stained with pale yellow oil grew out. Klein knew him, and he was Mr. Azek's father, the death of the fourth epoch, Emperor of the Underworld Salinger. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.